Welcome back, Fan-Fueled family. Today's video is a project that's been in the making for a while now, and I'm happy to finally bring it to you. The new Monster Hunter game, Monster Hunter Wilds, releases today, February 28th. In honor of that, I've been working on this project to celebrate 21 years of the franchise. Now, I'm not the biggest expert on Monster Hunter. I find the combat a little on the slow side for my tastes. I played a little bit of World back when it came out, but that damn Puke kept dropping me over and over, and I ultimately got so frustrated with it that I abandoned it entirely. That said, it does have really cool monsters and fascinating lore. A few months ago, I was chatting with a few friends and the question was raised, could the hunters from Monster Hunter defeat the weapons from Final Fantasy VII? Since I'm not a Monster Hunter expert, I've brought in someone who is. I'd like to welcome friend of the channel, Aki, back.
Hello everybody, and thanks for having me back. I wouldn't describe myself as an expert, but I've been a fan of the Monster Hunter series since the 4th generation, and I'm starting to build a rep for a general analytical approach to things. So, with a bit of research and all the hours I've invested into the series, I'm hoping that I can enhance the conversation that we're going to have today.
So here's what we're going to do. Aki's going to tell you a bit about Monster Hunter, its characters, its world, the monsters, and the general premise of the franchise. Next, I'll cover each of the 5 weapons briefly, and then we'll discuss each weapon in turn and how the hunters would attempt to take them down. Aki, take it away.
Sure. So first off, the setting of Monster Hunter is what I'd refer to as a post-apocalypse. It's thousands of years after the Cataclysm. The world is rebuilt, and the game takes place in the civilization that has sprouted out of the post-apocalyptic world.
A bit like Horizon Zero Dawn, where it was a bustling, technologically advanced society, but humans screwed it up and they had to rebuild. Now it's Viking-styled cultures. Monster Hunter is sort of like that, just more giant monsters and fewer robot dinosaurs.
Yeah, and all the Monster Hunter world knows of the old world is that humanity screwed up the balance of nature, and nature lashed out to balance the scales.
Gee, why does that sound so familiar?
Heh, there's an implication that this rebalancing took the form of a monster, and possibly is the origin of all monsters. But whatever it was, this is the event where the planet started fighting back. Eventually, that civilization was entirely wiped out, and the remaining people these days have very little cultural memory of whatever happened, just myths and legends. And now they rely on the Hunters. The Hunters Guild is the governing body of the current civilization, a civilization which is very akin to your Horizon series example. Mostly horse and buggy in terms of transport, low-tech, small buildings, rudimentary uses of gunpowder, sort of high medieval era, low mid-Renaissance in terms of your tech level. The Hunters Guild does have a sort of central governing authority. There are rules that the Hunters Guild does set out, and it occasionally will send out an envoy to make sure that those rules are being followed. But for the most part, each territory governs itself with relative independence. You don't have, for example, hunters from Kokoto Village, the main village in the original Monster Hunter game, telling the people of Jumbo Village, the main village of Monster Hunter 2, how to run their lives or their hunts. And even the settlements can be pretty different. Valhabar, the main village in Monster Hunter 4, is very different from Komura Village, the main village of Monster Hunter Rise. And in Monster Hunter World, you're basically operating out of a research outpost. So, what do the hunters do? Well, they hunt. Not just wildly or indiscriminately. They monitor the balance of nature, watching how humans and monsters interact. Their goal is to prevent another apocalypse.
Because humanity might not survive another apocalyptic monster reaming, we're looking at an organization that's trying to ensure that their entire species isn't wiped off the face of the planet.
Yeah, and it's also about ensuring that the monsters don't run rampant, that the balance of nature is maintained. So, you have these really powerful monsters called Elder Dragons. Now, Elder Dragons aren't always dragon-shaped, and are definitely not friend-shaped. It's less about being a dragon, and more a category or classification of power. It's not even power, it's more capacity. An Elder Dragon is basically a walking calamity. Elder Dragons do things like generate tornadoes just by being there, or spew fire in great quantities from their bodies, or sometimes they exude some kind of horrible toxin. Just being near one is dangerous, and most hunters can't even get close to them. Usually, when you see an Elder Dragon, you run. You run as far and as hard and as fast as you can, and you pray that it doesn't follow you. In Monster Hunter World, the Hunters Guild sort of notices that every 15 years, Elder Dragons seem to just up and vanish, like they're being summoned. The hunters, needing to keep an eye on the balance, thought, that's weird. Every 15 years, a bunch of the Elder Dragons we've been keeping tabs on sort of just go this way.
Let's go this way!
There seems to be this mass migration of tons of Elder Dragons every 15 years, and that's more than a little scary. We don't know if they're breeding or holding a conference on how to destroy us. We don't know if there's another continent out there. We have no idea what's in the ocean.
Water. Water is in the ocean, and probably lots and lots of monsters with big teeth. They'll chomp and bite and rip and tear.
Right, and that lack of knowledge is worrying. So that's how we get to the new world, where Monster Hunter World takes place. The hunters get a massive expedition together, and they head out to follow the Elder Dragons. They discover this continent. That's why the majority of the game is based out of that one camp. That's the only lasting settlement the humans have made on the whole continent. The expeditionary force got there and decided, well, we need a home base, and so they built a ramshackle base, hodgepodged it together with bits of their ship and monster parts. Over time, they expanded it to be a bit more of a home. And they basically run that themselves, with very little input from the mainland, as long as they follow the basic tenets and procedures from the Hunters Guild, with allowances thrown in for special circumstances. In Monster Hunter Rise, for comparison, the center of the game is this big town, based on feudal Japan, with the Lord's Manor in the middle, surrounded by lesser noble houses, and then, whatever, peasants and stuff beyond that.
Okay, so that's the basics of the world and the government and everything. What about the hunters themselves? Who and what are the hunters?
A hunter is an individual of exceptional physical and mental ability who, for one reason or another, decided that they want to spend their life hunting monsters. Usually the motivation is financial. It pays really well to be a hunter. The whole civilization relies on hunters for its continued existence. So as long as you're a decent hunter, you're pretty much set.
So it's kind of like being a knight or a samurai. It's a position of honor and nobility. You're venerated as a hero.
Right. As long as you're a decent hunter, you get paid really well, you're very comfortable, you're set up with your own lodgings, food is really generous, you get the best support staff and equipment and everything.
Now, I'm sure there are other motivations than money, right? Some hunters genuinely want to serve the greater good, keep that balance of nature and humanity.
Sure, that's reason number 2, altruism. They genuinely want to help the city, or the balance, or maybe they were saved as a kid by some great hunter, and they aspired to it ever since. Like we said, hunters, especially the really skilled ones, are like heroes, almost like gods.
I remember the first time I met her. It was like meeting a goddess.
And then there's reason number 3, personal vendetta.
Right, a monster killed my family, I'm gonna hunt them all down.
Exactly. Now, the way the Hunters Guild manages people like that in most situations. Hunters are generally not allowed to just go out of town and murk a monster unless they have a certified job from the guild.
Something akin to a writ of assassination in Morrowind, where if you get into the Morag Tong Assassins Guild, you're given these honorable writs of execution that are legally binding with the government. You can kill your target in plain view, present your writ to the guards, and they'll just be like, yep, your paperwork's all in order, sorry to hold you up, you're free to go.
Right. That's effectively what it is. A contract issued to take out a monster or a group of monsters. What usually happens is a villager or traveler or merchant, or sometimes even scouts for the Hunters Guild, will see a problem with a monster. Maybe it's not behaving the way it should be. It's moved into the wrong territory, it's threatening to become an invasive species, or it's particularly aggressive and is attacking caravans at a higher rate than normal for those kinds of monsters. So these people will go to the Hunters Guild in the nearest city and say, hey guys, there's a giant chicken that's eating all of my livestock.
Ugh, f***ing Puke again.
Oh, Puke isn't super chickeny. I'm talking about the Yankutku or Yangaruga. Man, if you're annoyed with the Puke, wait until you meet a Yangaruga. It's like a Puke with the poison, but also spits fireballs out of its mouth, or the Gypsaros, which spits poison and flashes you with its weird chicken head crest.
Outstanding. That sounds like so much fun.
So once an official writ is issued by the Hunters Guild saying this monster is a problem and we need somebody to go get it, a hunter will go to basically their manager or quartermaster and be like, hey, what jobs are there nearby? And the quartermaster will pull out their big list and say, okay, these are the guys you're authorized to take on this week. This authorization is generally based on the hunter's rank, so you don't have newbies after a giant monster, because then you have corpses or injured or trapped individuals that have to be rescued. That just causes more problems. So once a hunter passes their entrance exam, they're a 1-star hunter. Then they take on a bunch of missions for the city, and after they take enough, they get the right to take on an advancement test. And if they pass that, they become a 2-star hunter. They can now take on 2-star quests. And they can keep doing this up to a maximum of 7 stars. Somewhere in there is the high rank exam, after which you'll have to level up a hunter rank, which is done just by completing proportionally difficult quests. And when you get high enough, you can take a G rank exam, although the more recent titles have referred to G rank as master rank. High rank monsters are bigger, stronger versions of other monsters. Everyone's fought a Great Jagras, but a Great Jagras that's high rank is bigger, they hit harder, they're tougher, and generally they've got a wider variety of moves that they can throw. And G rank is basically the high rank. And the Hunters Guild keeps track of not just the Hunter's stars, but their numerical ranking as they level that up.
Sort of like One Punch Man, where you have different classes of hero and different ranks within that. So the lowest are C class, and they're usually pretty weak, just normal humans with some fighting skill or some light gimmick, and they're numbered. 1 is the best, Moomin Rider, and then it counts down. You have B class, A class, and finally S class are the elite, with heroes like Tatsumaki who can effortlessly murder a city-destroying monster with their mind.
Right? So your best hunter is G3, and then you've got bronze, silver, and gold crowns. Right, so G3 gold crown, and then they can level up their hunter rank up to like 999 or whatever. Those are the guys that are authorized to do more or less anything. Take on any hunt. They're the badasses. They are to the rest of the world what the Master Chief is to humanity in Halo. The ultimate badass. These high-end hunters kick ass and are too busy kicking ass to even take names. So when a hunter goes out and takes down a monster, they're authorized to harvest a certain amount of components from the monster. Bones, horns, feathers, flesh, scales, whatever. The hunter brings these materials back to the camp, and the specialist in the camp will be like, oh, with this, I can make you a nice upgrade to your weapon, or some armor that's better than what you have now. So, for example, if you spend enough time fighting a Great Jagras over and over again, you'll be able to salvage enough to make a nice pair of bracers, or maybe a nice breastplate.
So that's where you get Keating armor and weapons that are seen in a lot of gameplay footage and stuff, just fighting the Keating over and over again until you have enough bits to make weapons and armor.
Yeah, if you want to deck yourself out in Keating, you gotta kill a lot of Keating. Now, there are some exceptions. Stronger pieces of gear will sometimes require specific and rarer parts of a monster that you might not be able to salvage from every attempt. And some weapons or gear are going to require components from, like, minerals or a specific kind of plant, or other monsters in order to supplement and create the specific effect or reaction that you're looking for. Sometimes a monster isn't native to your region, so what the Hunters Guild will do is set up a monster fighting arena, and if you can win, they'll give you tokens you can exchange for armor and weapons that someone farms somewhere else. But generally speaking, you wear your kills.
In our faith, you keep what you kill.
And this, again, ties into the theme of balance. The hunter is using parts of monsters to enhance themselves, to become stronger. They're part of nature that way. Components from stronger monsters often have some sort of essence they'll impart on the hunter. Powers, abilities, elemental effects. All armors have elemental resistances and weaknesses, and that's something hunters will keep in mind. If they're going to fight a monster that breathes fire, they're not going to wear armor made from the hide of something that's vulnerable to fire.
And I assume this extends to weapons to a degree as well?
Right. Weapons in general don't have abilities on them, but they'll have elemental properties or apply status effects.
That'll be important for one of the encounters we'll discuss.
That's a surprise tool that can help us later.
Right. And some of the armors, in addition to being really tough armor and having elemental properties, will have effects like increasing movement speed or dodge distance, or how fast health or stamina recovers. Really high-level armor can even have modification slots and decoration slots, where hunters can add additional trinkets that further boost their abilities. Most just are physical effects like that, but there are some exceptions. Some skills make the hunter more proficient at certain things. The artillery skill increases the damage of your explosives, either representing a greater knowledge in how to best implement or use them, or some kind of magical affinity that makes them stronger. Handicraft somehow makes your weapon sharper. Again, either by increasing your proficiency or knowledge on how to best use what you've got, or by magically augmenting it. The Bloodright skill, which is mostly found on Malzeno armor, who's basically a big vampire dragon, gives you the ability to heal from dealing damage to injured parts on the monster, like you're draining its blood. This likely represents some kind of property inheritance that you're getting from wearing the monster's pieces. And we see something similar in armor set bonuses, where wearing enough of the same monster's armor will grant additional effects.
So obviously a hunter doesn't just go to their quartermaster, get a contract, and immediately set out and bum rush a monster, right?
I mean, not if they're good. A good hunter, that is, a hunter that wants to live more than a few days, will take time to prepare. They'll talk to more experienced hunters, they'll talk to the scouts, they'll talk to the person that reported the monster. They figure out what they're up against, and they specifically prepare their armor, weapons, equipment, and their mindset.
It's not a question of just overwhelming the monster with brute force, because that doesn't work against the more dangerous monsters. It's more about what can this thing do and how can I mitigate that?
Right. That's exactly it. Most monsters are bigger and stronger than you, so you ask your friends, you ask your more experienced brothers and sisters in arms, you ask the scouts, you get as much information and insight and prep as you can.
Like Batman's approach. Most of his greatest victories aren't him just punching someone way stronger and faster than him until they go limp. His most impressive victories are him taking weeks or even months to study, plan, analyze, and prepare, and then going in with a specific set of equipment and understanding so he can thrash even DC's gods. So do the hunters all have this sort of camaraderie? Or will some hunters just refuse to tell others anything they've learned because I'm not going to help you because I want you to fail your mission so I can get ahead of you?
I mean, you have occasional rivalries, but no hunter can truly stand on their own. Every hunter knows, fundamentally, that they're part of a team.
So you have these rivalries, but they're more friendly. It's not like any of the hunters are actively trying to kill each other. It's more like Neji and Rock Lee in Naruto Shippuden. They're good friends, they know they can count on each other when the going gets tough, but they do have that healthy sense of competition.
Exactly. Hunters know that they live and die by their support network. Unless you're one of the really legendary hunters, you can't fight most bigger monsters on your own. You need support. 1 or 2 people there. People who can take the monster's eyes off you long enough for you to put your weapon away and drink a healing potion when you need to. And at the end of the day, all hunters are working for something far bigger than individual glory, the survival of their species. There's ultimately that spirit of cooperation. Now, you do get the occasional hunter with that mentality of superiority, especially near the top. some of the top hunters are kind of assholes, like Byakuya in Bleach. It's not that he doesn't recognize that he's part of the Soul Society. He just looks around and sees everybody else as lesser than him.
Right, because he's awesome and cool and wins at everything forever.
Yeah, he just sort of expects you to follow his lead and do what he says, because you both are part of the same organization, with the same goal. But he's better than you, and knows better. So you should just do what he says, so you do get people with that mentality.
But they still recognize that they can't fight the entire monster ecosystem on their own. There are just too goddamn many of them.
Right. You can't be in two places at once. That's another thing. There isn't really competition for jobs because there are so many of them. So many monsters with contracts on them, and a ton of space. One hunter couldn't do it by themselves. If there were only the top hunters for an entire region, a city would easily be overrun, because while one hunter is dealing with a big threat in the south, there's another pack of monsters to the east, and the Rathalos attacking the city's northern wall. It's just too much for one person to handle.
So there's sort of this general understanding of we're all in this together. We may not necessarily always be friends, but we respect each other, we respect one another's abilities, and we work together for our survival and the survival of humanity. No man is an island.
Yeah, when it comes down to it, they're not swinging at each other, they're swinging at the monsters. Now, in some games, it is possible for you to nick your friends with a stray attack.
But no explicit PvP, just friendly fire. So what happens if a hunter goes rogue, just starts slaughtering monsters indiscriminately?
So the Hunters Guild itself doesn't deal with that usually. There's a sort of Black Ops group called Monster Riders that generally handle those scenarios, and the Hunters don't know about them, for the most part. The Hunters Guild does have some specialized units called Guild Knights that can be used for enforcement, but the Riders normally take care of the full-on rogues.
Right, we'll get into a bit more detail on them much later in the video, but you can give us sort of a general overview now.
Yeah, Riders aren't technically associated with the Hunters Guild. They raise, train, fight, and live amongst monsters in small, secret villages.
It's like one of my Japanese animes.
Mostly, they do smaller jobs in more remote areas, little villages that it's just too inconvenient or might take too long for a hunter to come out to. But they'll also deal with rogue hunters. Hunters that get it in their head that they can do it all on their own.
That they are an island.
Yeah. Or that monsters are evil and all need to die. And they build some kind of doomsday weapon or try to wipe out all the monsters. And when they need to be stopped, that's where the Riders come in. Hunters are really good at fighting monsters, not at fighting other humans. So the Riders are generally able to use their own skills and work with their monsters to take a rogue down. The Riders generally have to go in with less information and still make things work out. They don't really operate with the same information network or support staff that Hunters are accustomed to.
Okay, so anything else to cover about the Hunters themselves?
We should probably cover the camp helpers, starting with Phalens, the cat people.
I thought they were called palicos.
Okay, so Phalen is the species, Palico is the job.
Okay, because I was like, palico. It's a calico, but it's a pal. Really, Monster Hunter? We'll get more into them when we talk about the equipment hunters use. For now, let's briefly talk about the weapons, what they are, why they exist, and so on. So the weapons are at least 2,000 years old, likely far older. They're basically the planet's answer to threats to the life of the planet itself. Most theories suggest that the weapons were created by the planet to destroy Genova, an ancient alien entity that was a calamity from the skies that crash-landed on the planet around 2,000 years before the game. They ended up not being needed and were sealed away in a glacier of Mako crystals, the same thing materia is made of, and they went dormant. When Sephiroth acquired the black materia, allowing him to cast a spell that could destroy the entire planet, the planet deemed it enough of a threat that it woke the weapons.
For thousands of years I lay dormant. Who has disturbed my...
Hey, best buddy!
Oh, it's you.
It could also have been the Genova cells in Sephiroth's body that triggered the planet's awareness. In Final Fantasy VII, there are 5 weapons, though later games added a few more. Since I have no experience with Jade Weapon or Omega Weapon, we'll focus on the original 5. That's sort of the scope we're dealing with here. The weapons are enormous, bigger than anything else in the Final Fantasy VII world. We'll talk about it more when we get to Diamond Weapon and Ruby Weapon, but they're all likely between 400 and 600 meters tall, and that's a conservative estimate. We'll talk about Sapphire Weapon first, because we know the least about it, so there's not as much non-speculative information we can draw on. It's the only one the player cannot fight. About a week after the weapons awaken, Sapphire attacks the port city of Junon. It's a giant, blue, serpent-like sea monster. The Shinra military retaliates with conventional weapons, artillery, rocket launchers, heavy fire from machine guns.
It blew right through us. 50 cal rockets didn't do a thing.
Eventually, Sapphire swims up close, and while it's charging its laser, the massive Junon cannon fires at it point blank and blows its head clean off. Given the model in the cutscene, it looks like Sapphire is easily 100 to 300 meters long, making it one of the smaller weapons, but still absolutely enormous. This cannon is the same one we see in Crisis Core, where Sephiroth spars with fellow soldiers First Class Angeal and Genesis. And that's sort of a general idea of scale. This massive thing is the small end of the weapons. Sapphire has no legs, so it's not going to be moving on land with any kind of alacrity, if at all. It can swim at high speed though, and while we don't know too much about how it would fight, we do know it can fire a continuous beam of concentrated energy powerful enough to burn a hole through several feet of metal for a few seconds before needing to recharge. Diamond Weapon arises after the party figures out what Aerith was doing when Sephiroth killed her, why she didn't attempt to defend herself. Diamond is a bipedal, massive monstrosity with a silvery carapace in the game, perhaps implying the reflective sheen of a diamond. It emerges from the water by the northern continent and slowly marches its way towards Midgar, just walking knee-deep in the ocean. It's likely drawn to Midgar either by the massive concentration of Mako there, the misuse of the planet's life force, or by the raw negative energy and murderous intent that is gathering in Midgar. Determined to prevent Diamond from just obliterating the entire city and killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people, the party intercepts it when it gets to land. Diamond doesn't even really seem that fazed by the attacks of Cloud and his friends. It fights them for a little while, but then seems to lose interest and turns to continue on its way to Midgar.
I'm done.
What?
I'm done fighting you. I'm bored. You're boring me.
Diamond fires a barrage of energy at the same moment that the Sister Ray, the same cannon from Junon, adapted to fire a blast of pure Mako energy powered by all 6 remaining Mako reactors, each of which is enough to power a city, fires. The shot pierces through Diamond Weapon and keeps going, knocking Diamond off its feet and throwing it backwards. This gives us a fairly good idea of how big Diamond is. The base of the Shinra HQ building is on the central pillar of Midgar, meaning it's around 300 meters above the ground at the bottom floor of the building. The building is 70 stories tall, so that's about another 300 meters, and the Sister Ray seems to be about 3/4 of the way up the building, so around 225 meters up. That means that the shot fired from the Sister Ray was about 525 meters up when it hit Diamond in the chest. Because the Sister Ray was aiming at the far more distant northern crater to take down Sephiroth's barrier, and indeed the shot does do this, it means that the cannon wasn't aimed up or down, it was a straight shot, placing Diamond at least 650 meters tall. Its strength is in its durability. It will not take damage from physical attacks, standard attacks, morph, death blow, and so on, until its armor has been cracked by heavy magic damage and limit breaks. Its biggest weakness is its sluggish movement. It's very slow, taking multiple seconds between each footstep. Next up is Ultimate Weapon. It's the only weapon that can fly, and it'll use that to its advantage. If it feels it's losing a fight, it will not hesitate to just up and fly away at immense speed. It's first encountered hovering over the crater where it landed near Junon, and when engaged with the High Wind airship, it'll fight. After 3 to 5 turns or a certain threshold of damage, it'll end the fight and flee. To fight it again, you'll have to chase it down and ram it again until it stops flying around. At this point, there are 2 kinds of battles, aerial battles and grounded fights. This shows that Ultimate is comfortable fighting on the ground or in the air. Each battle will go for a few turns or until enough damage has been dealt, and then it'll decide it's had enough and off again. We'll talk about this more when we discuss the fight proper, but the hunters will need to find a way to pursue Ultimate over vast distances or just wait for it to return to its crater, which it does sometimes. Ruby Weapon is probably the most difficult fight in the entire game, and it's foolish to go anywhere near the thing before you're max level and have the best gear and equipment and have an escape strategy. Well, unless you're one of those nut jobs that can solo Ruby at level 1. That's a thing, look it up. Ruby is one of the more passive weapons, just sort of hanging out in the deep quicksand around the Gold Saucer desert area and doesn't really seem to have any interest in actively engaging the party. However, if the party does attack it, it will retaliate viciously to the point of trapping the party so it can ensure that it kills the foolish flesh bags that dared attack it. If the FMV cutscene and overworld model are to be believed, Ruby is easily 700 to 900 meters tall, maybe taller. We have a sort of general sense of scale. Ruby often hangs out around the Gold Saucer, and its overworld model is a little shorter than the tip of the Gold Saucer. When you first go to the Gold Saucer in-game, you take the Ropeway, a cable car that is so high up it passes over the clouds and the ground below is just a brown blur. The Ropeway station is near the middle of the casino in overall height, and Ruby is way taller than that. Assuming the top end of my estimate, Ruby Weapon is taller than the tallest building in the real world, the Burj Khalifa, which is 828 meters tall. Because Ruby is in the sands, you cannot engage it on foot. You have to either ram it with the High Wind or a special kind of chocobo that can run on sand. When attacked, it lets out a roar of fury and leaps from the sand. Finally, Emerald Weapon is one of the most feared super bosses in gaming. It wanders the sea floor and is rather passive. It won't pursue the player's submarine. If the player rams into it, it will start a 20-minute timer. If the timer runs out, it's a game over, implying the party succumbed to drowning or the crushing pressure of the sea floor. Emerald's size is hard to gauge since it appears in one cutscene and that's it, but that cutscene shows it's comparable to other weapons, so it's likely 300 to 500 meters tall at least. Emerald has the most HP of any monster in the game at a massive
1,000,000.
Okay, so something I think would be pretty important to discuss is the weapons that the hunters use, so we have an idea of what kinds of gear the hunters would be using in these scenarios so our viewers have something to reference. Like, if we say gun lance or heavy bowgun later on, we want even the people who haven't played a single Monster Hunter game to know what we're talking about.
Sure, I'll do a rundown on each of the hunter's weapons, strengths, weaknesses, and general applications. Armor is comprised of helms, gloves, chest piece, boots, and the lower body, greaves, terugis, stuff like that. Each armor piece has its own characteristics, and some sets have special bonuses if you're wearing enough pieces of the same armor set, like I mentioned earlier. The different weapon types are greatsword, longsword, sword and shield, dual blades, hammer, hunting horn, lance, gun lance, switch axe, insect blade, charge blade, bow, and the different types of bow guns. The Monster Hunter MMO games Frontier G Genuine, Frontier Z Zenith, and Explore add 3 more weapons. Respectively, these are the Tonfa, the Magnet Spike, and the Excel Axe. There are 2, well, technically 3 categories of hunter weapons. We'll talk about the third one in a bit, because it might make some people mad. The other 2 categories are your Blade Masters, which comprise all of the melee weapons, even the ones without blades, and gunners. And the gunner weapons are the types of bowguns and the bow. Let's look at the gunner weapons first, since there's fewer of them. Bowguns are semi-customizable. In some games, they're more customizable than others, but there's usually something you can swap out. Different barrels, scopes, accessories, stuff like that. The light bowgun is faster, but does less damage, while a heavy bowgun hits harder, but generally it's much slower and fires slower. They can also enter into a siege mode where they're immobile, but can fire a ton of shots without needing to reload.
So sort of like the Gauss Cannon Siege mode in Doom 2016, where it locks you in place while it charges, then fires a bolt of pure concentrated death.
Light bowguns are much more light. They have larger magazines, but don't nearly do as much damage, but they're much more maneuverable. They also get their own kind of specialized ammo, and work better with the support bullet. Things like buffing ammo that boosts stats of allies that you shoot, or healing ammo that just outright heals your allies when you shoot them.
So love bullets? You shoot your allies and they feel better?
Yeah, love bullets. Light bowguns in Monster Hunter World and Onward actually also lay mines, which regenerate over time, so you don't consume a limited resource. They do despawn over time, so you can't just, drop 100 of them, then lure in an Elder Dragon and just win. But you can use them for traps and such, if you time it right. What's also neat is that these mines will amplify damage based on what they're hit by. So you can have some light bowgunner set down mines, then, when the monster gets close, have the heavy bowgunner use their charge shot, and it'll amplify the damage. This plays into the aspect of camaraderie we talked about earlier. The hunters work together. Medium bowguns are retired now. They're a sort of middle ground. They can do some of what light can do, and some of what heavy can do. They were mostly present in Monster Hunter 3 when the bowgun customization mechanics got really in depth, and you could really sort of mix and match your bowgun features. Your medium bowguns would just be in between the ranges for what defined a heavy bowgun and what defined a light bowgun. They were retired mostly because there was never a reason not to use the medium bowgun.
The devs wanted the players to have to make that choice, spec into light bowgun or spec into heavy bowgun. Now, looking at the three of them, light bowguns look a bit like a battle rifle or designated marksman's rifle. Medium bowguns are more like anti-material rifles, the kind of stuff you'd see used to take out armored vehicles, and heavy bowguns, that's just a cannon, dude.
I like big weapons!
Right, and there's still different ways to build it. You can build the heavy bowgun with a power barrel to maximize damage output. You could also put a shield on it to give you a defensive option, which is neat for a gunner. Heavy bowgun focuses more on damage with their ammo. Cluster shots, basically like mortar shells, scatter shots, basically like shotgun shells that just blast multiple projectiles in a spray. Piercing shots are great for getting through armors and hitting monsters throughout their longer body parts. Now, different individual guns can load different shots. There are plenty of light bow guns that can still use the cluster shots, but generally you see specialization on the heavier ammos with the heavy bow gun and on the support and status ammos with the light bow gun. The roughest part about any bow gun is that you're shooting ammo, and your ammunition is a fixed amount. That's stuff that your hunter has to carry with it. Your gun carries an infinite supply of ammo 1, which is like the tiniest of tiny caliber, almost like Derringer shots. But most of the fancy stuff, that is going to require you to use up what is an effectively limited resource. And most light bow guns have one or more ammo type that they can rapid fire, which fires multiple shots of that type of ammunition without consuming more than one bullet. And that can help you manage your limited bullet capacity a little bit more. And lastly, we have the bow, which is a little weird to me because it's not, a gun of any kind. It's just a longbow. You get infinite arrows, but each arrow does less damage. There are things to consider like charge level and critical damage, but your big difference is, again, the ammo. You still have pierce arrows and spread arrows and all kinds of weird trick shots that are normally determined by your specific bow and the charge level of your shot. You can rain arrows down from the sky anime style, and you even have a super arrow, the Dragon Piercer. It's slower but does a ton of damage. Then you also have coatings, which can add different effects, like close range and power coatings, which increase the damage output of your arrows in general. And then you also have status coatings, like poison and paralysis, which is going to be really important later for one particular fight.
Are you starting to see a pattern here?
Anyway, those are the gunner weapons. For the Blade Master weapons, first is the Greatsword. It's a really big sword, like Cloud's Buster Sword on steroids.
Super steroids. These things are huge. For a size comparison, Cloud's Buster Sword is a single-edged blade about 6 feet long and a foot thick. While we don't have a cannon weight, it's likely around 20 to 30 pounds, assuming optimal materials like zinc aluminum alloys or carbon fiber forging. Now, to give you an idea of how wildly impractical that is, a medieval claymore used by the Scots in the 1400s averaged around 5 feet long and weighed about 6 pounds. The biggest one ever used was 7 1/3 feet long and weighed around 22 pounds. Cloud's Buster Sword is far bulkier and thus more unwieldy. It's realistically more of a crushing weapon than a slashing weapon. Monster Hunter Greatswords are even bigger than that. I mean, this one from a Monster Hunter Wild screenshot looks like it's around 9 or 10 feet long and at least 2 feet thick. So yeah, super steroids.
Right, so the Greatsword is capable of blocking, which reduces sharpness, which is sort of a melee weapon's damage modifier, and also can affect the armor penetration of the weapon. It's also capable of outputting a huge amount of damage, and requires precision, because different parts of the blade do different damage. If you want to maximize your effectiveness, you have to be really careful about where your slow, heavy swing connects with a monster. Greatsword is also capable of charge attacks, to make things even harder to hit. Next is the Longsword. Longsword is technically correct terminology, but it doesn't really do them justice. They're sort of similar to Sephiroth's Masamune.
So basically they're no Dachi.
Yeah, and they're a medium damage, middle speed weapon, and its specialization is the Spirit Gauge. One thing the hunters are able to do, and it's never really explained how this sort of pseudo-magical power works. My favorite explanation is that the hunters do some kind of ritual that makes them more physiologically similar to monsters, allowing them to draw on the planet's natural energy. So the Longsword's way of doing this is the Spirit Gauge. As a hunter attacks, their gauge builds, which gives them access to stronger combo attacks and finishers, and makes their strikes less likely to bounce off monsters' armor.
So it's a bit like a limit break, to make another Final Fantasy VII analogy.
Sort of. It's got a bit more build-up. Almost like if while you were building your limit break, you also went Super Saiyan, but not as incremental.
Oh, so like the Premium Heart, Tifa's ultimate weapon. As her limit gauge fills, she does more and more damage, and when it's full, she's doing 4 times normal damage per hit. But when she finishes unleashing her limit break, the gauge drains and she's back to her baseline.
Right. Like that, but with specific levels. So when you fill up each of your 4 levels of your gauge, you move faster and hit harder. It's all about landing those hits. The final shots of your combo build up your Spirit Gauge so you can unleash your super anime attack. Next is the Sword and Shield, and it's probably the most versatile weapon. It's significantly smaller than most other weapons in the game, but it's capable of blocking light and even medium monster attacks. It's a light category weapon, though, so it's fast. you're more maneuverable with it than you are with something like the Greatsword. So it's really good for party kinks that want to run around in front of the monster. It's capable of doing slashing damage with the sword and bludgeoning damage with the shield, which can stagger or stun monsters. Another really neat thing is that the draw speed is fast, so you can put it away and pull it out quickly, enabling a lot of interesting terrain interaction. In more recent games, they changed it so that you can use items while your sword and shield is still out. It's the only weapon you can do something like that with. And when they introduced it, sword and shield users became a lot more technical because they could defend to buy time for their team, but could also use all kinds of support items at a moment's notice. Then, sort of the opposite of the defensive focused sword and shield, you have the dual blades, which entirely eschew defense. They're all about rapid, aggressive attack, but have no way to defend. They have the demonization mode, which drains stamina, but boosts damage and attack speed, and gives the wielder access to the demon dance, which is a powerful, infinitely chainable combo attack. Some of the games have Archdemon mode, which is sort of like the longsword spirit gauge. When you attack monsters while in demonization mode, you'll build up a gauge, and in Archdemon mode, all your attacks are more powerful, and your dodge roll is replaced with a demon dash.
But because it draws on stamina instead of its own gauge, you have to be careful about dumping everything into the demonization mode and then running out and being a sitting duck for the monster's most powerful attack. Probably why I screwed up with them in World, because I said, "Oh, these are fast, these'll be fun," and then I went in and got my shit wrecked by a great Jagras.
Yeah, they're fast, but hard to get a good feel for initially. They're powerful, but have a steep learning curve. When you use them really well, you feel like an untouchable anime badass. So a lot of people really like them for that reason.
Yeah, I'd probably like them if I had the patience to get good. Also, I just wanted to share an amusing behind-the-scenes anecdote. When we were going over this and I was looking at the Monster Hunter wiki, my lizard brain read demonization mode as demonetization mode, and I'm like, well, can't talk about that on the channel.
Maybe a fan-fueled fiction after dark. Anyway, you mentioned when we talked about it earlier that it made you think of Attack on Titan, where you rocket around the battlefield slashing everything. Sort of. It's more like Sword Art Online, where the main character's super mode in the first season is drawing a second sword.
As opposed to Kenpachi's Araki, where his super mode is one sword, two hands.
An important lesson. That a sword becomes much more powerful when it's swung with both hands instead of just one.
So next up is the hammer. Hammer go bonk.
Hammer go bonk. That's it. Moving on.
But seriously, the hammer deals bludgeoning damage, and they're one of the few weapons that cannot do slashing damage, so you can't do stuff like cutting off a monster's tail.
Right, but they go bonk.
Yeah, they go bonk really well. They're less bothered by bouncing off of monsters' bodies and sort of crush a monster's hardpoints. They do stunning and knockout damage really well. It's relatively easy to bonk a monster on the head and drop them. Not make them die, but be completely stunned. Of course, this means that the hammer users usually need to dance around the front part of the monster's face, which is, you know, the bitey end, with all the teeth. Hammers are medium weapons, so they don't have a ton of mobility, and they can't block, so they're not great defensively. They also have a charge attack to deal even more bonk. And next up is the hunting horn.
Can't you see he's the man? Let me hear you applaud. He's more than a man. He's a shiny golden god.
It's basically the hammer, but for bards. It doesn't do as much damage as the hammer, doesn't swing as fast, but you can trigger the recital ability, making every swing play a note, and you can combine the notes to produce different effects. Buffs for your party, healing for your party, decreased stamina consumption, that sort of thing.
So it's like bardic inspiration.
Sure. The problem is that it's hard to get the right notes out in the heat of a fight. So it's led to a lot of players just sort of backing off and playing their songs in the corner to buff the party, then running in to help bonk, and then backing off when the buffs were out to play them again. It wasn't great, so the devs sort of made it easier in the more recent games to string your combos together in battle, and gave the hunting horn a couple more damage options in the form of a spike that can do small amounts of slicing damage, and fun little sound waves in bombs. Next is the lance, arguably the most technical weapon. They're medium weapons, so not super fast, but they have a nice shield to block, and more importantly, they can charge up and parry or counter attacks. They can KO monsters with a running shield bash. They're very technical and hard to play well, but can be really powerful. They gave players a dragoon-like jumping attack in more recent games, but it wasn't super powerful until Monster Hunter Rise, where it had way more mobility. In all games, the lance's block, counter, and parry ability make it a very strong weapon when used in the hands of a master. Really gained a ton of utility in Rise because of the wire bugs, which we'll talk more about later.
My first ever subscriber's favorite weapon is the lance, actually. Shout out to Just Spencer36 for helping. He got a lot of the weapon footage you're seeing on screen.
Yeah, thanks. Made our job a bit easier. Okay, so the next weapon to talk about is the gun lance. The gun lance is like if someone said, I like the lance, but I'm not good at countering. What if my lance exploded?
Something very unexpected happened. You exploded.
What if Monster Hunter, but Ruby?
Sort of. They've got much less range than your typical Ruby weapon. Like, Ruby's Crescent Rose is a high-caliber sniper sight. It's got range and power. Even Yang's Ember Celica have pretty impressive range. We see that when they fight the Nevermore during the initiation, right? Gun lances fire explosive shots, but they're fairly short-ranged. It's called shelling, and it's more or less just an explosive burst at the tip of the lance. So a gun lancer's usual combat rotation is a combination of charges, thrusts, stabs, and explosive blasts. They're heavy weapons though, so they have very low mobility. But to compensate, their shield has a really strong block.
So it's all about that ability to recognize when the time to attack and when the time to defend is.
Right. You have to be able to block well, because you can't dodge well with the gun lance. The gun lance has a certain number of explosive shells fired out of the tip that you can make go boom.
Make go boom?
Make go boom. The shell attacks are very strong, and they bypass a lot of armor and defensive abilities, so they'll be really good against Diamond Weapon. They do need to be reloaded, but as a game abstraction, you never really run out of reserves to reload from, unlike the bowguns, which actually use ammo. There are three kinds of shells: normal, long, and wide. The diagram on screen shows an approximation of the range and radius of each, and that leads me into the next ability, the Wyvern Fire ability that lets the gun lancers fire a powerful blast. In Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate, Wyvern's Fire does 4 times the damage at 4 times the range, giving you a super high damage, slightly longer ranged option. But it's a charge-up attack, and it runs on a cooldown, so it's not something you can use on every occasion.
I've seen people say that the wide shot is mostly good for, and I quote, clearing out trash mobs.
Yeah, it can be with its wider spread. Then Monster Hunter World added the Worm Stake Shot, which can be used at the end of a combo to sort of stab a spike into the monster, which deals impact damage and explodes after a second or two for even more damage.
Sort of like the Raiso from Attack on Titan, the, what's the English name? Thunder Spear. Just ram it into a monster and...
Better watch out! It go boom! Sticky bomb meet Mr. Stupid!
Yeah, something like that. When it comes to the gun lance types, normal shot type gun lances have the largest magazine, but the lowest individual shell damage, so it's more effective at full bursting. an attack that fires everything in the clip in one big burst, rather than clinking with individual shots. Wide shots are for the people that just want to go boom, and don't care much about swinging their stick, except to aim. These are the strongest shells, and the explosions are the biggest. They really just want to point stick go boom. Long shot types are sort of a middle ground. Smaller magazine than the normal shots, but a bigger magazine than the wide shots, and damage in the middle. They do best with the fancier gun options. The switch axe is also very Ruby. The whole transforming weapon thing, it's basically an axe that can turn into a sword. Axe mode is the default, and while drawn, movement speed is similar to if you're holding the longsword. But while the sword is active, it's more like a greatsword. When the weapon is in axe mode, it's sort of gathering energy, and when it's charged, you can switch into your sword mode for super powerful attacks. Kind of like an electro sword in Star Wars, with the power crackling all over the blade. Eventually, the power exhausts itself and it reverts back into axe mode. You also have files, which are able to boost your weapon's effectiveness when it's in sword mode. Power boosts attack power, elemental boosts elemental damage, that sort of thing. Paralysis files could come in handy against one of the weapons.
But is it also a gun? No, I'm kidding. But let's move on to your favorite, the Insect Glaive.
Oh yeah, I love the Insect Glaive. Go ahead and put the Japanese name on screen, because it's kind of neat. It's the Sochukan, literally translated as Insect Taming Staff. It comes in two parts, the insect and the glaive.
Really? I would have never guessed.
Right? Wild. Most glaives have a bonk end and a blade end. Pretty normal so far, right? But it's also got this bug. This little guy is your buddy. He's called a Kinsect.
A friend-shaped bug.
Absolutely. And in Monster Hunter 4, the game where the Insect Glaive was introduced, you could actually raise your Kinsect yourself. So you could end up with a weird little dude really tailored to your combat style. Like, you could raise it to have a lot of speed and stamina, but not a lot of attack power, which would make it great to harass or distract a monster. In more recent games, like Monster Hunter World, Kinsect upgrading is a little more standardized. Upgrading your Kinsects along a tree as opposed to having a leveling system for them. It still gives you some variety, but not as much direct customization. Your Kinsect normally hangs out on your arm, but during combat you can send it out to attack a monster, like a bug projectile. Your glaive is capable of firing a marking attack, basically a shot of essence or a pheromone. And if you send your Kinsect out to attack while a monster is marked, it'll automatically home in on that attack spot. And it'll keep attacking that spot until it gets exhausted and comes back home. World also added the powders, so that when you marked a monster with your glaive and your Kinsect went out to attack the marked spot, it would create a little cloud of flies or smoke or a small swarm of insects. And then, when someone hit those clouds, it would go off. And depending on what kind of powder you used, it would have different effects. Poison, paralysis, healing, explosions. Another really cool part of the Insect Glaive is that your Kinsect brings you extracts. When your Kinsect attacks a monster, depending on where on the monster it hits, it will extract some of that monster's essence or power. If you hit the claws or fangs, parts that are normally used to attack, you'll get red extract, which increases your attack power and makes you capable of stronger combos. If you hit the legs or wings, parts that are normally used for mobility, it'll give you white extract, which makes you move and attack faster and it increases your aerial mobility. If you hit a tough or armored part of the monster, you can get orange extract, which boosts your durability and increases your resistance to knockback and flinch. Tails and specialized parts of a monster would sometimes get you green extract, which would actually heal you. But that was removed in Monster Hunter Rise for reasons? When your Kinsect returns to you to rest, it gives you that extract to power you up. And if you can get all three buffs at the same time, the red, white, and orange, you enter your super mode, where your attacks get way faster, your combos are much more fluid, and hit harder. And that's ultimately the power of the Insect Glaive, because it's a light weapon, like the Twin Blades. The main component, aside from the bug, is the glaive.
Right, and that's what a glaive is. It's sort of like a naginata. It's a polearm with a single-edged blade. In fact, there's an insect glaive made from a variant of my favorite monster called a naginata. The pure Naginata Sumi is an insect glaive made from Violet Mizutsune parts.
Yeah, it's that blade, and some also have a blunt end, a bonk end. The other thing that the glaive does better than anyone else is jumping attacks. It's great for aerial control, launching yourself into the air, staying up for longer, and knocking enemies down. Aerial attacks can also bypass hard points, so you can attack heavily armored monsters more easily.
Right, and I remember when I first got Monster Hunter World and I asked you what weapon I should use, and you said, well, my favorite weapon is the Insect Glaive, and my stupid ass took that to mean you should use the Insect Glaive. I got my carcass handed to me over and over and over until one time I managed to pin a great Jagras in the neck and mount it.
Yeah, you can fly around the monster and harass them from the sky. And aerial attacks also deal mounting damage, which makes it easier for you to force the monster to the ground and wail on it until it can get back up. In 4, when you mounted a monster, you would sit on its back and stab it with a little survival knife.
Baby knife!
Next up is the Charge Blade. It's a lot like the Switch Axe, in that it switches between 2 modes, but it starts in a sword mode, and changes into an axe mode when it's powered up. In sword mode, it functions a lot like the Sword and Shield, but a little bit slower and you can't pull your items out. Your attacks in sword mode gather energy, which you can store in files, which can be used to charge up your shield, which becomes the blade of the axe when it transforms, allowing for really powerful explosive attacks. The files are a similar style to the Switch Axe, but you only get impact files and elemental files. The Charge Blade also has guard points, moments in your combos where you can auto-block a monster's attack and build up even more charge. I like the Charge Blade because I like the idea of taking the monster's energy, building it up inside my weapon, and then unleashing a super explosion that makes the monster wish it had never evolved.
Now, you said you weren't too familiar with the Tonfa, Magnet Spike, and Excel Axe, so why don't we keep the explanations on them brief so we don't offend the people that really like them?
Yeah, and if you're a fan of any of the weapons that we only went into light detail on, and you think that we missed something important, especially Tonfa, Magnet Spike, and Excel Axe, let us know in the comments. The Tonfa is one of the lightest and fastest weapons, and gives a ton of mobility even when drawn. You can launch the hunter into the air similar to the Insect Glaive. It has 2 modes, normal mode and short mode. In normal mode, it just goes bonk. In short mode, it gives a ton of really useful aerial control, and lets the hunter do really fast attacks in the air and on the ground, with swift kicks and rolling attacks.
Looking at the Magnet Spike's picture here, it looks a bit like an over-the-top fantasy bow, but it seems to be a melee weapon.
Right, it's huge, so it's a heavy weapon, but it uses magnetism to reduce the weight, and it can switch between impact damage, bludgeoning, bonk, and slashing damage. So as you attack, the magnetic files build in power, sort of like the Switch Axe. It can then go into super speed mode.
Neat. So what about the Excel Axe? What in the world is this thing?
This is an axe that consumes energy as it attacks, but unlike the Switch Axe or the Charge Blade, it converts this energy into pure speed, giving it a charged up burst slash and a piercing aerial slash, which both hit multiple times.
Haha, Excel Axe go brrr.
Seems that way. Like I said, I'm not too familiar with these last 3.
Let's talk about equipment now. First, I want to discuss wire bugs because they're really cool and I want one.
I know, right? A wire bug is this friendly little bug that hangs out with you, and you can throw it. It'll leave this magical Spider-Man thread behind, which you can swing on or wrap around your weapon to empower it in various ways. In a similar vein, hunters in some regions will have grappling hooks, like your slinger in World, which they can use to latch onto flying monsters like the Remobra, giving them fast mobility around and into a battlefield.
Which will be very useful in these fights considering the weapons are pushing 300 meters minimum. Being able to sort of fly to get out of the way of area attacks quickly is going to be imperative to both attacking and surviving.
Apparati like the Slinger are also used as wrist-mounted launchers, which can use items like rocks or even parts you break off of the monster as ammo. There are also man-made projectiles like knives or small grenades that can have status effects.
Like the paralysis knife, which will inflict paralysis. Do you get it? Do you get it yet? Paralysis will be important later.
Yeah, spoiler alert, it's going to absolutely trivialize one of the fights later.
Anyway, so the Slinger, it's sort of like Mira's wrist-mounted mag sling in Knights of the Old Republic 2. It can launch rockets, poison darts, and grenades farther than a person can throw them, and can use all kinds of different ammunition.
Exactly. Hunters always go in prepared. They have a backpack with pouches for healing items, like potions, buff items like demon drugs, or armor powders that can even strengthen or heal the entire party. And there are status cure items like antidotes and null berries. Hunters also generally carry a large field knife that they can use to do things like cut ropes, monster parts from corpses, scrape essence for ingredients, and so on.
Baby knife.
Hunters will also have traps. The standard ones are the pitfall trap and the shock trap, which is like an electric web. But those are probably not going to be very effective against monsters the size of the weapon, especially since Elder Dragons are immune to traps like that, and the weapons are way bigger than most Elder Dragons that we've seen, the only exception being the Laviente, which is just under 450 meters long, and thus around the same size as the weapons.
Right, the second largest monster we've seen in the franchise to date is the Zora Magdaros, which is less than half the height of Diamond Weapon, and Zora Magdaros is immune to traps.
But one thing that may be able to affect them are bombs. The most common bombs in Monster Hunter are barrel bombs, basically kegs of gunpowder with a fuse. There are also grenades, sonic grenades, flash grenades. They're not really meant to do damage, but just create an opening. Barrel bombs, much like the light bowgun's mines, can have their force increased by what sets them up. Normally, there's a maximum you can carry at any given mission, but that might be a gaming abstraction.
And against something of the weapon scale and threat, the hunters are likely going to have a supply camp fairly nearby and runners to enable constant resupply.
Yeah, and when fighting monsters of this scope, hunters will typically set up supply drop locations or routes where they can pick up more gear during the fight. Something I think will definitely be significant here is siege weaponry. When hunters know they're going up against something like this, they'll employ emplaced weapons, ballistae, cannons, and in some of the more recent titles, a mounted rotary machine gun.
Now, just to make a distinction, yes, Barrett has an arm-mounted rotary machine gun as well, but we're talking apples and oranges in terms of power here. Barrett's gun arm uses smaller rounds with considerably less power. He doesn't want to over-penetrate an enemy and hit a civilian. He's probably using something close to 45 ACP, the round the Tommy gun fires. For this mounted gun, we're talking about something more like 50 BMG, or maybe even bigger like a 20mm anti-aircraft round. Remember, these are meant to actually harm giant monsters. Barrett's using a bullet more suitable for home defense. If you use 50 BMG or 20mm for home defense, your bullet goes through the intruder, through your wall, through the neighbor's fridge, through their TV, and nicks them as they get out of their car.
Yeah, if you're lucky. And then you get sued by your neighbor for shooting them, and you try to explain it was self-defense, and the judge laughs you out of court saying, maybe you shouldn't have been using anti-tank rounds for home defense, dude.
So these big weapons are designed to fight giant monsters. They're naturally going to be chambered in ammunition that's meant to damage monsters.
Yeah, the Zora Magdaros fight in Monster Hunter World is basically done entirely with siege weapons, except for a small phase where you actually get on his back. And in Monster Hunter 4, there's an Elder Dragon called the Daren Moran, which is basically a giant sand shark or sand whale, and you have to fight them on this sand skiff with siege weapons mounted all over it. And when things look really bad, that's when hunters generally custom build siege weapons to deal with the threat that they're facing. The most notable of these is the Dragonator.
The most 90s weapon name to ever weapon in a game not from the 90s.
Yeah, it's very 90s name. They're basically tree-sized spears with pistons powered by pressurized steam. When activated, they shoot forward and stab at a monster, though they're limited in range by the length of the spear.
Sort of like the automatic hydraulic battering rams used by some police and military forces.
Yep, but instead of breaking a door down, they're made to eviscerate giant monsters. They're limited in range, so you have to lure the monster close enough, but they do immense damage. They recharge, but it takes time to build up the pressure to fire again. They also need to be mounted into something really solid. A vehicle won't work because of the recoil, even if they could get the pressure buildup that they needed. If there's not enough support, they'd knock over whatever they're attached to, or bounce off the monster, or blow out the back of the mechanism. That's how physics works.
Aye, the laws of science be a harsh mistress.
The last thing we really need to talk about is hunter companions, chief of which is the Palico. Palicos are technically a species of monster, the Phalan, who have decided to take on jobs working alongside people. They're highly intelligent, capable of speech and using tools, and are generally friendly. Palico are surprisingly durable, capable fighters, and they'll typically serve as assistants with their own equipment, tools, and skills that they can pull out to help. They usually take on a support role to assist them at camp or in town, or to pull injured hunters out of the fight who are no longer capable of continuing and bring them back to camp.
Right, that was one thing that confused me when I played World. That Puke just murdered me. Why am I waking up at a camp? It should have eaten me. I'm not even angry. I'm being so sincere right now, even though you broke my heart and killed me.
Okay, GLaDOS. But yeah, what's happening there is that some Palico are specifically trained to run into the fight, grab the unconscious hunter, throw them on the back of a cart, and pull them to the nearest town or base, so they can get patched up and brought back into the fight. Generally, we in the community call this being carted. If you're carted more than 3 times in a single mission, they generally assume that you're not skilled enough to finish the mission, and it's considered a failure. Then you have to go back, train, improve your skills, prepare better, and then you can give it another shot. It's a game abstraction that operates so that your character doesn't die. But the implications is that these Palicos are operating in addition to the Palicos that are actively assisting you with the fight, such as your Palico partner, who's attacking, using healing and support abilities, or whatever. I also want to talk about Palico hunters, and I know that this is a divisive element in the community that some people love and some people hate. But in Monster Hunter Generations, you could enter Prowler mode, basically playing as a Palico, but operating as a hunter. Prowlers are faster than hunters and have infinite stamina, and they're way more agile, but they're physically weaker and more fragile, and they can't wear nearly as much armor. Prowlers also use Palico armor and weapons, which are much simpler than the hunter armor. Prowlers generally operate better than your NPC Palicos because, you know, they're player controlled. And I think Prowler's damage scales higher than NPC Palicos, but that might just be the increased skill and efficiency of using them. Prowler's health could also be reduced to 0 3 times before they carted. Prowlers would get back into the fight by consuming an acorn, which be replenished either upon fully carting or by going back to camp to rest. Prowlers are sort of an honorable mention here because I don't think they're going to significantly add a variable against the weapons, but since we discussed all weapon types, including the ones that only exist in MMOs, I thought it was important to bring them up too. In addition to Palico as hunter companions, there are also the Palamoos, which are ninja dogs that you can ride into battle, and they have their own sets of attacks and abilities.
And you mentioned that they can hold weapons in their mouths, right? And I made the analogy to Zacian from Pokemon, the legendary wolf that carries a hero's sword in its mouth. I was talking to another friend, first ever subscriber JustSpencer36, and he mentioned, and I apologize to all the Dark Souls players out there, you're about to start crying, Sif, the great grey wolf from Dark Souls, who also carries a sword in its mouth to defend its master's resting place.
Or Rapide from Tales of Vesperia. Though he'd never let anyone ride him into battle, it's a not completely uncommon trope in fiction. But yeah.
So why are we telling you in depth about every single weapon that the hunters use? Why are we going into such detail about their equipment? Because we need to make you understand what a hunter has at their disposal, the very varied options that the hunters can bring to bear. Sure, they're post-apocalypse, but they aren't hurting for equipment. The weapons are a massive, world-ending threat, but you need to understand going in that the hunters have a chance here.
Right, and that's what you need to go into the next section with. The knowledge that no matter how outmatched they seem, they have a chance, because world-ending threats are nothing new to the Hunters Guild.
And that leads us into the next part of the discussion. Where are we having them fight? An encounter in the Monster Hunter universe may be drastically different from one in the Final Fantasy VII universe just because of the way the natural energies of both sides behave.
So, are we looking at one world or the other? Or are we hybridizing them? And that's what we settled on. A hybridized world, which presents its own issues, but will give us the best chance to look at both groups with their full capabilities.
We'll look at individual scenarios much later on, but for right now we're going to focus on a world where the hunter's powers and abilities function and where the weapons are able to act as they do in Final Fantasy VII. So in Monster Hunter, well, why don't you explain, Aki?
Alright. Monster Hunter relies on a sort of natural energy that the monsters, and to a lesser extent, the hunters, can draw on. It seems to be a mix of biology and natural energy. The Kirin, for example, is a thunder monster. It's an elder dragon that can call lightning, but that ability comes from a thunder sac in its body. So that seems biological, but when hunters remove that, they can use it as part of a weapon, and it never seems to run out of electricity. That seems more magical. Also, certain weapons with certain special abilities, like Demonization Mode, is all about calling on natural energy, and in a world other than the Monster Hunter world, that kind of natural energy might not be accessible, or even present. We'll discuss the Behemoth later, which appeared as a crossover event between Final Fantasy and Monster Hunter, but the behemoth behaves very differently in Monster Hunter compared to its appearance in Final Fantasy, and that could be a result of these natural energies.
Like Aki said, we'll talk about that later. We do have a connection between the two franchises, but it's tenuous at best. And we don't know how the weapons will react to a lack of the lifestream. They could go totally dormant and just be part of the landscape from then on, or they could panic and go into Rampage mode. So we can't make these sorts of wild assumptions.
At least not yet. We'll talk about alternate scenarios at the end of the video. This way, we have the more wild assumptions set apart from the main discussion. And the Monster Hunter games have a lot of diverse biomes. There are deserts, tundras, giant rainforests, deep-sea trenches, mountains, volcanoes, badlands, island chains, coral reefs, and I know you wanted me to mention the Rotten Vale, a monster graveyard full of rot based in the corpse of a giant Dolomador.
Right, and because of the indigenous monster life, we can get situations not unlike in the Monster Hunter games where you can be so focused on one giant monster that you don't notice others coming over to attack. The hunters could be fighting Ruby Weapon in the desert when all of a sudden Adara and Moran comes up, a giant elder dragon sand shark, and is like, "Well, hey guys, what's going on over here? Wow, that's a big red thing. You fallen down, will eating you help?"
Yeah, now most monsters will leave Apex monsters alone. Apex monsters here being the baddest on the food chain, not literal Apex monsters, which is a subcategory of monster. But most monsters will leave the Apex in their environment alone because they'll be eviscerated. But some are just so aggressive that they'll attack anything in their territory. The Tigrex, for example, will go after bigger, tougher monsters because it's just so violently angry that the big monster is in its territory. That can lead to other considerations, like if the hunters are setting up their siege weapons, they'll usually drive off the local monsters, but sometimes they just show up again anyway, at the worst possible times, to harass the hunters.
That is it! I am stopping this now!
Oh, what are you doing?
What am I doing?
Thwarting my plans?
Sorting your plans?
Are you?
You know what? Yes!
Remind me to never go to the Monster Hunter universe. It sounds like a living nightmare. Giant monsters attacking out of nowhere, no video games, no phone, no internet, can't make videos for you guys.
There are nets though, and it is a video game, if that counts, which we both know it doesn't.
No, I'm out. You can isekai me into another fantasy world, just not Monster Hunter.
Noted, but be careful what you wish for. The best we can do analogizing between the Final Fantasy and Monster Hunter worlds is the Behemoth crossover. But this is, like we said, tenuous at best, because they're wildly different combat systems, wildly different environments, on both a physical and metaphysical level, and wildly different depictions of the Behemoth between Final Fantasy games. The one in the crossover was a Final Fantasy XIV version, and that's not the same monster that's called Behemoth in Final Fantasy VII.
And so the best we can do is say, this is the Behemoth in Monster Hunter, this is how it correlates to the Behemoth in Final Fantasy XIV, this is how that correlates to the Behemoth in Final Fantasy VII. It's like running the Gettysburg Address through Google Translate 8 times and expecting it to make sense. It's not going to. To use your words, Aki, it's a different translational matrix. Even Final Fantasy VII to Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth isn't a great analogy because they fundamentally changed how damage, HP, and MP are handled. Final Fantasy XIV is a decade or so later than the original Final Fantasy VII, and it's an MMO, so different rules apply.
Exactly. So we're going to have to make a lot of assumptions, and if you think our assumptions are way off base, leave a comment. We want to hear your thoughts.
And we'll get into the more analytical minutiae later, especially with things like what qualifies as materia. Does the fact that the hunter's weapons and armor call on the natural energy in monsters qualify as materia in the same way that materia orbs call on the planet's life force and knowledge? Or is it more like if Cloud ripped the fire-breathing organ out of a dragon and squeezed it to make it shoot fire? Especially if we're looking at a setting where the hunters are zapped to the Final Fantasy VII world, because Rebirth makes it clear that's an important distinction. Those born of the planet return to the planet.
We who are born of the planet, with her we speak, her flesh we shape. Unto her promised land shall we one day return. By her loving grace and providence, may we take our place in paradise.
Right. The games make a distinction that things from the planet are forever part of it, and things that are not can never truly be part of the life stream. Like with the Gi tribe, they're from a different world, and even though they've lived on the planet for centuries, even though they're dead, they can't return to the life stream because they didn't come from it. So, in Bugenhagen's words, after death, the ghosts of the Gi like stagnant air. So, it's possible that the hunter's materials would not be recognized as part of the planet in this case, and not trigger materia-based effects. Even though the Gi shaman can use magic, it's not the planet's magic, so the powers of the hunter's equipment probably would still work. But it wouldn't be magic in the Final Fantasy VII sense.
It's like Genjutsu in Naruto. Most targeted Genjutsu other than the Sharingan, things that target the mind, would not affect someone not from the Naruto world. Genjutsu of that nature functions by affecting how chakra interfaces with the senses, not with the mind directly, so someone without chakra wouldn't be affected.
Right, and to tip our hand a bit into spoilers, if they fight Emerald Weapon last, and they've harvested parts from the other weapons, would that count as materia for the purpose of Emerald's attack that targets materia? You've theorized that the weapons are basically just living materia, so would they count as such for the purpose of this designation? But we're getting bogged down into hypotheticals and ahead of ourselves. Why don't we discuss the first of the weapons?
Right, so let's talk about Sapphire Weapon first. We know the least about it, so there's really the least to be able to work off of. Get it out of the way. You know, like Shinra got it out of the way with a point-blank shot from the cannon. Sapphire is the only weapon that you don't get to fight in Final Fantasy VII. It shows up about a week after Cloud gives the black materia to Sephiroth. Rufus Shinra, president of the Shinra Electric Power Company, is arranging a public execution of Tifa and Barret because he's an asshole and says that the people need a scapegoat. The people need someone to blame, and this way they're not pointing fingers at Shinra. I refer you to my earlier statement, Rufus Shinra is an asshole.
Even though it is Shinra's fault for creating Sephiroth in the first place, through Professor Hojo's experiments.
Right, even though it is their fault. So Tifa's brought into a gas chamber because apparently Shinra's big military bases all have rooms specially built for inhumane executions. Scarlet ties Tifa in the chair, then slaps her because Scarlet is a bitch of unprecedented magnitude. Scarlet tells the press that the executions will be broadcast live around the world, and then the alert goes out that Weapon is attacking. And Scarlet is all upset because nobody is sticking around to witness her victory over Tifa, someone who is objectively better than her in every quantifiable way. So Sapphire is seen in the distance, swimming towards Junon, this massive fortified port city, and tons of soldiers and turrets and whatever else are all deployed. They start firing shells and automatic weapons and rockets at Sapphire. None of it even seems to faze Sapphire. Like, it doesn't stop, doesn't slow, doesn't even feel it. Then, the Junon cannon fires a shell the size of a building and blasts the water. It's like a nuclear bomb detonation. They think they've got it, but Sapphire re-emerges and keeps coming, and they need time to reload the cannon. Sapphire rams the city, then lifts itself up and fires a beam of plasma from its mouth that just slices through the reinforced front of the building.
Conveniently creating a way out for Tifa in the process.
Quite convenient. So it rears back for a second shot and the cannon fires. There's a rush of smoke, and when it clears we see that the shot blew Sapphire's head clean off. There's a stump and yellow blood? Ichor?
Could be oil for all we know. We don't know what the weapons are. Biological, mechanical, biomechanical, or even entirely magical. It could even be pure magic in such concentration and pressure that it's a liquid.
Anyway, that's the entire extent of what we see of Sapphire. It's not in the data, there's nothing to data mine, and you don't fight it in any other game. Well, other than Final Fantasy XIV, and that's explicitly a man-made imitation, so we can't really extrapolate. It was rumored to be planned to be the final boss of Final Fantasy XV's Luna Freya DLC second chapter, but that got cancelled because I guess we just can't have nice things. So all we know is it would likely be classified as a black dragon, like all the weapons, the highest level of Elder Dragon. We know it has a plasma beam with a 2 or so second warm-up and cooldown, and we know it can't really move on land, just swim.
so the hunters will need to beach it in order to have a solid advantage, or get enough time to set up their siege weapons. It does have the beam weapon, but we've only ever seen it use that at close range, a few dozen meters at most.
Right, so unless it's really aggro and just always wants to engage in close range, well, I guess that is supported with it charging in and ramming the city. It does look like it's the smallest of the weapons, and it may be the weakest, though that's based on just the very little information we have on it.
The main question here is, do the hunters have a way to engage a monster of this size out on the open ocean? Or do they have a way to lure it to the shore to engage it with siege weapons? Yes, the answer is yes.
Right, and can the hunters dodge out of the way of that mouth beam? I'd say yes. We've established that the hunters have crazy reflexes, and this thing has a charge up of about 1.5 seconds or so with very visible heat mirages around its mouth. They'll know it's coming, and it doesn't explode, it burns, it melts, so it's not going to create a blast. It should be pretty simple to dodge. That's basically a non-issue. The bigger question is whether the hunters can move their siege weapons around fast enough to get them out of the way. Once the first volley goes off, Sapphire's going to want to blow those things up.
The Dragonators? Probably not. They need to be secure to handle the recoil. But they could build the ballistae and the machine guns and the cannons on sliding tracks to keep them fairly mobile.
And if they have to engage it in open water, mount the siege weapons on a big galleon and keep Sapphire busy with smaller skiffs, harassing it so its attention isn't on the big ship?
Right, distractions, especially during the galleon's big cannon volleys.
And I think that's the point here. The biggest advantage the hunters have over the weapons is that they're smarter. They can strategize, change tactics on the fly, divert resources to flank and create openings. They can distract and harass and confuse.
We haven't seen the weapons ever display the ability to innovate. They just follow their inborn initiatives, like with Diamond Weapon, and we'll talk about that one more later, but it just feels this pull towards Midgar, so it just stops fighting against Cloud and turns to head towards Midgar. It doesn't have a choice to keep fighting Cloud, it has to go to Midgar.
Right, and we see in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth that the weapons have this sort of imperative. They hurt threats, they leave non-threats alone. There's a scene where Tifa falls into a reactor coolant pool and is swallowed by a weapon that looks like a whale. It shows her these visions, then deposits her up on the reactor platform and sort of nudges her towards her friends. A mindless beast would have just devoured her, but there's this imperative to not hurt or even to protect those that are not threats or maybe allies of the planet. It's an inborn imperative of, this squishy human is not a threat to the planet, she's an ally, I will not hurt her. She's a friend, not part of the problem.
Right, and since hunters help maintain the balance between nature and mankind, the weapons might not even recognize them as a real threat until they start dealing damage. Some of them might not even defend themselves against the hunters.
Yeah, but we want them to fight. Having them sing Kumbaya and all be friends isn't as interesting as smashing action figures together. We'll touch on that idea of the weapons not being hostile at all at the end of the video, but for now we're going to make them slug it out with the hunters.
For Sapphire Weapon, I don't think it's too much of an issue. I think between the scouts and their existing experience fighting giant monsters, they'll maybe lose some equipment, some siege weapons will get blown up, and that's about it. The hallowed Gen Moran is about 112 meters long. That's around the low end of our estimate for Sapphire, and the hollowed Gen Moran isn't even in the top tier of Elder Dragons in terms of power. The hunters handle this thing without a big ordeal, so Sapphire isn't anything they're not mostly used to, at least at a global guild level. And the hunters have taken on monsters that breathe death before, so the mouth beam is nothing too out of the ordinary.
Yeah, the hunters will lose some gear, maybe a few ships will be sunk, but that's an acceptable price to pay when fighting a living apocalypse. A few hunters will have a bad day, but no casualties. So that's Sapphire Weapon. Overall, not a big threat to the hunters. So with Sapphire out of the way, let's talk about Diamond. We really see its power when it climbs out of the crater, its claws piercing the bedrock of the crater walls. Now, Diamond's biggest strength is that durability, but its greatest weakness is its lethargy. It's really, really slow.
You move like a pregnant yak.
It arises right after the party figures out why Aerith sacrificed herself, that she was praying to awaken the white materia, holy. That's one of the many, many reasons I love Aerith. She's this beautiful woman with a wonderful life ahead of her, and she was willing to give it all up to keep those she cares about safe. That selflessness is something I really admire.
Yeah, but if the world gets blown up, she doesn't really have much of a future.
True, but Tifa does say that Aerith was the one that talked about the future the most out of anyone in the group. She wasn't expecting to have to die, but when she realized what she'd have to do, she didn't shy away from it. She shouldered the responsibility. We're getting off track. I love Aerith. You guys know this. Moving on. So Diamond Weapon emerges right after Cloud and the group figure out that Aerith's prayer to Holy was successful, and you see it rise up out of the ocean, roar, and then slowly start walking towards Midgar. And I do mean slowly. It takes one lumbering footstep every few minutes. Well, feels like every few minutes. Sid, a party member and the pilot of the Highwind, the airship the party uses, he says that you have to fight it on the ground. Diamond is so tough that it would just keep walking and push the Highwind aside without even really noticing it, destroying it. Diamond eventually lumbers its way to land. It stands there for a moment as though processing, then roars, and then a battle begins. Boss music and everything. Which is weird. The weapons usually get normal battle music, not boss music. I'm hoping in Remake Part 3 they get their own unique themes. The battle against Diamond is slow. It takes its time. Its ATB gauge charges very slowly, the thing that determines the time between a fighter's turns. It doesn't really matter that Diamond is slow though, it's crazy durable. It's got insanely high defense and magical defense too. What's more, physical attacks just don't do anything. Not at first anyway. First you have to damage it with magic and limit breaks, which I've always interpreted as cracking its armor. After that threshold of damage with limits has passed, Diamond will open up its chest and start a countdown. When that countdown ends, it'll use Diamond Flash, which hits all party members for 7/8 of their current HP and inflicts silence. When the party does deplete Diamond's HP totally, it's not fatal. Diamond just sort of loses interest in the party and turns to go head towards Midgar. Cloud gets a call on the PHS, basically the game's cell phone because 1997. Kate Sith tells Cloud that Rufus has something planned, and we see the Junon cannon now moved to Midgar and hooked into the entire Midgar power grid. So this is a city-sized cannon powered by 7 super nuclear reactors, and it drains all the city's power for one shot. And then... So this projectile, this beam of pure energy, screams through the sky, and it punches right through Diamond, knocking the skyscraper-sized monster flying through the air, and the beam keeps going to its intended target. Yeah, it just so happened that Diamond was directly between the muzzle of the Sister Ray and the northern cave, and the blast breaks Sephiroth's barrier.
Well, that was...
lucky? Fortuitous? Awesome?
Plot convenient. That's it.
Fair enough. But yeah, that's what it takes to bring Diamond Weapon down. It takes Cloud and his friends wailing on it for a while, then a massive off energy cannon with the power of 7 super reactors. But in battle, Diamond is, like I said, slow. It mostly attacks with physical stomps, but sometimes shoots blasts of energy from its face. These blasts are fire elements, so they can be mitigated by hunters wearing armor that reduces fire damage. Diamond specifically targets the enemy with the most HP when using its stomp attack. With Countdown and Diamond Flash, we only see the countdown and attack names as a game abstraction.
It's not announcing it with giant speakers or a laser light show in the sky. It's not shouting out,
"Show me what you got!"
No, certainly not, but the fact that it mostly stops attacking and is just looking from hunter to hunter might clue them in that, oh, it's about to do something really big, better get ready. It's not going to shout the numbers. I mean, it'd be kind of funny, honestly. Diamond just shouts, 3, and the hunters look confused. 3? No, there are a dozen of us. Can you not count? 2. 2? Wait, what? What do you mean 2? 1. Oh. The hunters are smart. They'll figure out that when it stops attacking, it means it's processing its next target. This is going to be a big one if this thing has fully stopped attacking. We have to find a way to hide or mitigate this. Now, we never see this in battle, but just before it gets skewered by the Sister Ray shot, it opens these shoulder panel things and fires a volley of energy blasts towards Midgar. Now, it's possible that these aren't great at close range or that they're not really accurate, volume of fire rather than accuracy. Of the 30 or so projectiles that Diamond fires, only a few connect, but they absolutely wreck the Shinra HQ. Diamond is very much a defensive fighter. It's super tanky, its attacks are all heavily telegraphed, so I don't see the hunters having any trouble surviving Diamond. The problem comes from actually damaging the damn thing.
Yeah, so do the elemental attacks on weapons count? Or what about the pseudo-magical abilities like demonization mode? Do those behave like limit breaks? And what about attacks that specifically ignore armor? Bowgun piercing ammo, for example.
Right, Diamond Weapon takes double damage from lightning element attacks, so get some Keating weapons and crack Diamond open like a lobster at a fancy dinner.
Then there's the question of whether the elemental damage would be counted independently. Weapons in Monster Hunter are almost never purely elemental. They almost always do some form of physical damage too.
Yeah, we mentioned this when discussing it, and having given it some thought, yes, I think they would. The element is still being conveyed, conducted, transferred. It may not be the physical damage that's doing anything, but the elemental effect on the weapon is. The fact that it doesn't do it in Final Fantasy VII is more a game abstraction. So it wouldn't do the same amount of damage that it would to, say, a monster, but it will still inflict damage. And that's all that matters, because the hunters are not going to have trouble dodging Diamond's attacks. Piercing attacks are going to maybe work, gun lances, bow guns, that sort of thing.
And it's pretty common in Monster Hunter to target and cripple a particular part of the monster. Crack armor to lower defense, cut off a tail to prevent a stinger from being used, so with the right preparation, they could handle it.
And the hunters would see Diamond coming for a day. It's not exactly subtle, so they'd be able to set up siege weapons.
Potentially. The only problem is that Diamond seems both willing and capable of unleashing mass destruction from pretty far away. If the hunters get close, it might just decide to open up on the nearest settlement. So they need to take out the shoulder cannons before it can do that, or there might be a lot of civilian casualties. Can the hunters do that? Maybe, with the Remobra and things like that, but hard to say.
The shoulder cannons take a good 4 to 5 seconds to charge, so they'd have a window to at least redirect its focus. Now, another issue is that Diamond Weapon was drawn to Midgar by the planet. My theory has always been that all the negative energy, the bloodlust, the hatred of the Shinra executives, combined with the reactors pulling all that Mako in at once, weaponizing the very lifeblood of the planet, that's what pissed Diamond off, drew its attention. The planet wants Sephiroth dead, sure, so it should want Shinra to blast that barrier down, but the planet doesn't think in terms like that.
And the towns in Monster Hunter won't have that negative feeling, but the monsters might, especially the more aggressive ones, like a Tigrex or Rathalos, that can get pretty territorial. But Diamond Weapon doesn't care. It's single-minded. It focuses on a goal, and you can drop a nuke on it, and it won't care. It'll just keep going. And things like Tigrexes are violent. They do kill for spite, for sport, for the sheer bloodlust of it. And the planet might find that abhorrent. With the reactor theory, that's different though. It implies that it's the fact that Shinra was using so much of the life stream as a weapon that offended Diamond. And Diamond was just like, you know what? You.
Right? A single reactor produces enough power in a day to power a city for a week to a month. Imagine drawing all of that at once, 7 times over. It's a beacon that Diamond was drawn to like a moth to a flame.
So it may have just been like, this is my quest objective. This is what's harming the planet.
I'm a fire in my ladle!
Memes! But Cloud and the party are totally insignificant compared to that giant, glowing, flashing middle finger to the planet that is Midgard. Sort of, okay, you guys are scratching my paint job, but I'm gonna go that thing up over there.
And at the ranges where hunters will be engaging it, the shoulder fire attack may not even be practical. Even on top of it being a last resort, I have to stop the Sister Ray trump card. And just like with Sapphire Weapon, and all the weapons really, we don't know if that's all it can do. Or, if it has more abilities, it just never got to use. Maybe it does have a super devastating mega upper that it just doesn't need to use because the stomps are usually enough.
Right, and we also don't know what it would be like if the planet said, it might shed part of its body and become super quick, or it might glow red hot and just melt everything it comes near, or grow spikes, or, well, why don't you tell us your favorite theory?
This is the coolest theory, that they all sort of megazord into one giant monster.
When I was a kid, I had this dream of actually communicating with the weapons, and they turned into armor and sort of Voltron together. It was awesome.
And I, Ruby Weapon, will form the head.
And we can't use any of this to base anything concrete on because it's all speculation. We were talking the other day about a video I had seen of a review of Kenpachi Zaraki's sword, Nozarashi, and they made this wild claim that the rounded hilt was difficult to use, but Kenpachi would like it that way. No, dude, your replica has a rounded hilt. If you look at the actual manga and anime, it's clearly not. You can't make claims about things that are based on fallacies and just assume them to be true. Worse, you can't present them as true.
Right, that's not how, logic works. So we can't just say, oh, well, Diamond's Rampage mode can teleport and shoot rainbows from its nose, because that's entirely unfounded. It's fanfiction. Now, in the end of this video, we'll speculate about a few possibilities, but they're explicitly unfounded. We're basing these encounters on what we've seen, what we know.
We can't say that the weapons will turn into a planet f***ing Voltron.
Yeah, where did you get that assumption?
I pulled it out of my ass. I mean, for all we know, when in Rampage mode, the weapons just activate a permanent peerless state, which, if you remember from my video on statuses in Final Fantasy VII, they just don't take damage.
Right? Or maybe they duplicate 100 million Ruby weapons. Think of all the tentacles.
Tentacles? Why did it have to be tentacles?
Okay, so let's talk about the next weapon. Ultimate is going to pose a bit of a different challenge because it flies.
Oh, they fly now! They fly now?
No! Nobody asked for flying kaiju. Come on! The hunters do deal with flying monsters, of course, but nothing flies as high up as Ultimate Weapon flies, and certainly nothing as fast as Ultimate. The thing can create a Mach cone. After I was almost done recording all the audio for this video, Just Spencer36 pointed out that Valstrax is a thing. The wiki says it flies far above human habitation, and the Generations Ultimate cutscene seems to show similar speed to Ultimate.
Yeah, they've never had to fight something in the sky like that. The Monster Hunter Wiki does talk about them using airships to deal with things like flying wyverns. They're able to withstand hits from Rathalos and monsters of that caliber. But the wiki describes the airships as being taken out easily by Elder Dragon level monsters. It even says they can mount siege weapons like ballistae and dragonairs. So it is possible that the hunters could build airships, if they became aware of Ultimate Weapon and deemed it a threat necessary to take out. Sure.
I think they would know about it because Ultimate's usual MO is to find a place it likes and then hover there for a while. When bothered, it'll fight, and then when it's damaged enough, it'll flee, screaming across the sky at incredible speed until it finds another spot it likes. Sometimes it'll land and it'll just chill on the ground. So it's very likely that with its patterns, someone in the composite world we're using will see Ultimate and just be like, That is a giant flying centaur dragon in the sky charging its laser. I'm going to go report this to the Hunters Guild.
And then the guild would deploy scouts, who would try to get close to it with the means they already have. And if that doesn't work, then yeah, they'd build something that could work. So the planners, quartermasters, engineers, and so on would come up with a schematic, maybe a giant ocean galleon, but they need to make it fly, so they figure out what they might need and then turn to the hunters and tell them, okay, we need X flame sacks and Y amount of wing webbing and Z amounts of durable bones from this monster. And the hunters would go out, get the supplies, and they'd build the legally distinct Highwind.
The Up in the Sky Zephyr? And of course, this is going to be a little different from the Final Fantasy VII game abstraction. That's turn-based. Ultimate patiently waits for the players to attack, hovering in place. That's not what we're looking at here.
Yeah, when the hunters jump on its back, Ultimate might just go, oh, there are a lot of little squishy things on my back. Better?
Do a barrel roll! The hunters are smart though. Once they see that Ultimate flies away when injured, they'll immediately realize, oh, we need to cripple its wings next time, and then once they do accomplish that, they'll be able to engage Ultimate on the ground, and from the little we've seen, Ultimate is far less nimble on the ground.
And you're still looking at something pretty durable, so the hunters will have to use barrel bombs, lances, bowguns, anything to get through that heavy armor. But they can do it.
Right, and Ultimate, aside from the flight, is a pretty simple battle. It's not super fast or tough or strong. Most of its attacks are single target attacks. Shadow Flare hits really, really hard, but it's a single target. It's not going to drop a whole fighting force. Its only multi-target attack is Ultima Beam, which is just a straight beam, so not that hard for hunters to see coming or avoid, especially on the ground.
So the way a fight like this would go in a Monster Hunter game is that hunters would have to get on Ultimate's back to cripple the wings, and if they stay on too long, it shakes them off. You'd have to get back to the ship and try to mount it again. Maybe use the siege weapons on the ship to harass it until it gets into a position where you can get on its back. Then get to the base of its wings and plant tons of explosives. Then get back to the ship to detonate it with a blast from a cannon or a shot from a bowgun. And you keep going until the wings are damaged too much to keep Ultimate at that altitude.
And a lot of it would center around defend the airship. On such short notice, it would be next to impossible to let every branch of the Hunters Guild know about the threat Ultimate poses, share plans for the airship, and so on, so you likely only have the one airship. If that thing goes down before you can either ground or kill Ultimate, that's it, game over. That said, the hunters all around the world might get the same sort of idea. Big-ass dragon monster in the sky charging up a beam that could nuke a city? Yeah, probably gonna need a way to take the fight to this thing, so you could get this interesting scenario where there are half a dozen giant airships all built in different styles from different regions. Now, one last thing I want to talk about before we move on from Ultimate is its death. When Ultimate dies, it's over Cosmo Canyon. That's scripted. The final battle always takes place in the Cosmo Canyon region. It lets out this low, sad howl and slowly sinks out of the sky, and as it makes contact with the ground, the screen goes white, and when the screen clears, there's no sign of Ultimate, but a massive crater where it landed.
Implying there's an explosion, and you want to know if the hunters would be able to deal with that explosion. So there are a few factors here. How big and strong is the explosion? We don't know. It's obscured.
It's gonna be big! Is it gonna be today?
And when a monster like this goes down, most hunters are going to get clear. Return to the ship, finish it with siege weapons. But you know, there's no accounting for those arrogant or overzealous people.
Right, maybe one nutball hunter decides to just Boris Grishenko it up, just go teabag Ultimate as it's dying, yelling, "Yes! I am invincible!"
Or some hammer user decides he's going to stand on Ultimate's head and go bonk while it dies, and then, boom.
And then the hunter's family gets a "We're sorry for your loss" card in a fruit basket.
It's not going to take out the airship, just like in Final Fantasy VII, it doesn't take out the Highwind. Depending on what the terrain allows, they might fly over and just drop the rest of their barrel bombs on it to finish it off. But they're not going to fly in with the ship and poke at it. They'll stay at range until they're sure it's dead. But in a Monster Hunter game, Phase 2 would probably, but not exclusively, be an on-the-ground hunt. Maybe Ultimate falls through into some catacombs when it hits the ground, and the ship can't get a clear shot at it, so the hunters have to go in on foot to finish it off. In a situation like this, unless there's some kind of telegraph for that final explosion, those hunters are probably getting caught in the blast, and it'll depend on exactly how strong that blast is and whether or not they had time to get clear or take cover as to whether or not there'll be anyone for the Palicos to cart back to home. Either way, they'll probably be a bit grumpy that there's no remains to carve from. No harvesting any bits of it for weapons or armor, but at least this flying world-ending monster is gone.
Now, the biggest issue for the hunters is going to be catching it. In Final Fantasy VII, it can fly faster than an airship that has high-power rocket jets. Ultimate is fast. They're not going to catch up to it, but maybe they can plot out trajectory, analyze areas they've seen it hover over to predict places it might stop, that sort of thing. If the hunters can do that, they might even be able to have Ballistae and Dragonators waiting to go, and as soon as Ultimate shows up, just unload on it.
Yeah, aside from the logistical problems of catching up to Ultimate Weapon that we just discussed, I don't think that's going to pose too much of a problem. It shouldn't be too difficult.
Right. So now let's move on to what I say is the hardest fight in all of Final Fantasy VII. That's right, it's time to talk about... oh boy, Ruby f***ing Weapon. Ruby is, in my mind, the hardest fight in Final Fantasy VII under normal conditions. Ruby is, surprisingly, one of the most passive of the weapons. After being forcibly ejected from the northern crater, it landed in the soft shifting sands of the Corel Desert, the area around the Gold Saucer. It doesn't seem to have any interest in attacking the player. It just sort of vibes there, head poking above the sand. That said, if it is attacked, it will retaliate viciously to the point of burying 2 of the 3 party members hundreds of feet under the sand and trapping the final person so it can take its time beating the hell out of them. Ruby's size is kinda hard to nail down. The overworld model, cutscenes, and other extrapolation leads me to estimate around 700 to 900 meters tall. The battle model is probably closer to 50 to 75 meters using Cloud as reference. I'm inclined to lean towards the former estimate rather than the latter because both the overworld and cutscene models line up with being around that size and the battle models are consistently undersized. Now, when the player rams Ruby with their airship, it roars in abject fury, then leaps out of the sand with the might of 1,000,000 terajoules of pure f*** energy. When the fight begins, Ruby will immediately use Whirl Sand twice, which is considered a removal effect. Final Fantasy VII has 2 kinds of removal effects, one where the target is flagged as still alive, and one where the target is flagged as defeated. For example, the Midgar's Alome can slap you out of the fight with its tail, but if you lose the battle, that party member is still alive, so it's not a game over. With Whirl Sand, the target is flagged as defeated, meaning if 2 party members are at full health and Whirl Sanded, then the last party member goes down, you lose. Game over. This implies to me that Whirl Sand isn't just tossing characters out of the area, but burying them hundreds of feet under the sand to slowly suffocate and be crushed to death.
Yeesh, pretty brutal. Kind of like Gaara's thing in Naruto, his sand tsunami.
Yeah, a bit like that. Once only one person remains, Ruby buries its fingers in the sand and tentacles erupt behind the player, trapping them. Until it puts its tentacles in the ground, Ruby is entirely invincible. It will take no damage from any attack, spell, ability, or limit break.
And this is a gaming abstraction, a way for the developers to ensure this one-on-one fight.
Right, and that's one of the most prevalent strategies. Enter the battle with 2 party members dead, then when Ruby puts its tentacles in the ground, use Phoenix Downs or Life 2 to resurrect your allies, then fight Ruby with a full party. Now, Ruby is not supposed to pull its tentacles out, but sometimes it just does? I mean, I have been poring over this code for like 4 hours, and I cannot understand how Ruby just sometimes decides to do whatever the f*** it wants. It's a nightmare. All I see when I close my eyes are 1s and 0s, and I think I saw it too.
There, it's okay. There's no such thing as 2.
My deduction is that Ruby is actually a hyper-intelligent cosmic embodiment of the fear and loathing humanity has for itself, and it exists in the gap between waking and sleep, and thus just does whatever it feels like. That includes giving its own code a giant, tentacly, building-sized middle finger. In all seriousness though, Ruby has a ton of devastating attacks. The tentacles, which will always hit from behind, do percentage-based damage, meaning they hit really hard, but can't kill the player. However, the right one can inflict frog and small, and the left one, which does damage to the target's MP, not HP, can inflict poison and slow numb, which is terrifying because it can lead to petrification, ending the fight. It can cast Ultima, which it'll do on its own every so often, and always in retaliation when hit by Knights of the Round, the most powerful summon in the game. It can cast Comet 2, which is like the D&D spell Meteor Swarm, just a quartet of giant explodey rocks that it hucks at the party. It can breathe fire, cast Shadow Flare, use Ruby Ray, which is a massive beam attack that inflicts confusion on one target, and it can swing its building-sized claws at enemies when they're not busy being hentai monsters.
Is Ruby vulnerable to any of the status conditions that the tentacles can inflict? Sometimes, hunters will use that sort of thing to fight, taking a monster's own abilities and turning it against them.
No, Ruby is immune to frog, small, poison, and slow numb. The hunters aren't going to be hacking off its tentacles and using them to sticky whip Ruby with its own attacks or baiting it into hitting itself. It can inflict the paralysis condition, which we'll get to in a bit, but only when its tentacles are withdrawn. The attack is called Big Swing, and basically Ruby winds an arm back and just pimp slaps the entire party. The three biggest threats I see that Ruby has for the hunters are Ultima, Shadow Flare, and, to a lesser degree, Comet 2. Ultima is the big one, and Aki, you and I talked about this in great detail, but basically Ultima is a massive blast of magical energy. Due to the gaming abstraction of 1997, it's impossible to say how Ruby's Ultima works, but it appears as a massive blast of green energy, pure magic, that engulfs the screen. The question is whether it's a constant damage effect in a vast area, or if it's like a single pulse wave and if the hunters dodge through it, they're fine. It does a ton of non-elemental magical damage. Shadow Flare is the other big one. It's a single target non-elemental attack that does heavy magic damage to a single target and ignores defense. I'm not sure if this would be dodgeable, again, gaming abstraction, but it looks like magic specifically gathers around the target from all sides, so it might be a guaranteed hit. Finally, Comet 2, or Cometeor to those who have only played Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, is another one where game abstraction comes into play. I say this is only sort of an issue because if it hits, it hurts, but the hunter should be able to dodge it pretty easily. All of that's a moot point, however, because Ruby does have one super glaring weakness, and it's crazy exploitable in Final Fantasy VII, and will be even more exploitable to the hunters: paralysis.
Ruby's weakness to paralysis is almost on par in magnitude with your level Fox's.
Hey! But, yeah, fair. Ruby Weapon is so vulnerable to paralysis that anything with that effect will freeze it solid. You could whisper the word paralyzed through a $10 Walmart walkie-talkie and it would lock up. In Final Fantasy VII, that's exploitable with the Hades summon and the Dazer's item, but the hunters are going to have an even easier time.
Hunters, like we mentioned earlier, can apply status conditions from their weapons. It's not like in Skyrim where it's one use and that's it. That's more like the bow's coatings. But a melee weapon capable of inflicting a status condition, that's a permanent part of the weapon. The way the game mitigates this is by having monsters develop a resistance to status conditions the more they're exposed to them, and a threshold for it to actually take effect at all. And the more you inflict, the less time each status lasts. Ruby just doesn't have that resistance, and we theorize that Ruby is entirely incapable of developing that resistance, so every paralysis will be instant and have full duration, because it's probably absent of all the biological or supernatural sources that the monsters are using to increase their resistance.
This trivializes Ruby. Sure, it'll take a few scouting missions for the Scout Corps to figure out that Ruby is so weak to paralysis, but once they do, they can just send in a squad of a few hunters and give 2 of them paralysis weapons. Then, they just take turns poking Ruby to keep it frozen while the rest of the hunters whittle its health down until it eventually falls. Sure, it'll probably take days, but with the ability to switch in hunters as necessary, remember, Ruby can't attack at all while paralyzed. There's no threat unless they mess up and Ruby gets an attack off. This strategy reduces one of the most feared monsters in the Final Fantasy VII world to a clicker game. Oh, it's moving again? Click it with my paralysis gun lance. Ruby's paralysis weakness is so potent that the item I use to paralyze it, Dazers, is just a cluster of needles. Something like that, casually thrown, would have no chance of penetrating Ruby's insane armor. Yeah, Ruby's defense stat is bonkers. It's nearly double the absolute maximum the player can achieve at a massive 480 physical defense and 500 magical defense. Despite this crazy defense stat, some needles with paralysis juice on them are enough to paralyze Ruby. Aki, you and I talked about this possibility that it's not even a biological susceptibility to paralysis, but a psychosomatic response. Ruby is somehow aware that this thing is capable of paralyzing, I must be paralyzed.
Yeah, or it could be a programming fault in Ruby itself, in the mechanical or organic machine that Ruby is.
Or not even a fault, it could be intentional. Like you described in the Sephiroth video, we cannot understand the mind of God. That's what the Sphirot are for, aspects of the divine we can understand and aspire to. In the same way, we can't understand what the planet was trying to do when it created the weapons. We only have a theory of what they're meant to do. Now, granted, it's a theory based on the assumptions of a sage that has spent his 120-year-long life studying the planet, but he's still a child compared to the life of the planet. Maybe the weapons aren't meant to wipe out all life.
I got it. The weapons are here to start the greatest rave that the world has ever seen. Ultimate is doing a light show with the big laser beam. Ruby's doing the music, which is why he's vibing over in the desert. It's mixing tracks.
Diamond is the bouncer, which is why it's stomping around. Emerald is doing the special effects, and Sapphire is that one annoying roadie that takes everything too far and headbutts people. Hey, it could be. The planet is inscrutable. And now that I think about it, Weapons of the Planet would be a killer band name.
And the reason why the weapons are so grumpy and retaliate so violently when attacked is because Sephiroth killed Aerith, the one who was going to be the lead singer with the heavenly voice.
Well damn, now I want an alternate universe story where this is what happens. And Sephiroth isn't evil, he just plays the bass for the group and does the male vocals.
Now, just to save the hungry fans out there who want an actual fight, let's look at whether the hunters could take Ruby if paralysis works like it does in Monster Hunter. The tentacles are more like stabs, so they're fairly easy to dodge. Shadow Flare could be a problem, assuming it functions the way you described. But it targets one person at a time, so plenty of time for the other hunters to help the targeted person heal up, and it's possible there's a dodge moment as the energy is coming together. Ultima is a bit of an unknown, but I suspect it could be handled with dodging, based on the animation in the game. Ruby Flame is just a big fire breath. That's an average Tuesday for a hunter. Comet 2, again like you said, super easy to dodge. The biggest threat I see is Whirl Sand. But if they can bait Ruby into burying its tentacles, it doesn't use that, right?
It's not supposed to from what I can tell of Ruby's AI script, but you know, screw the rules, I'm Ruby Weapon.
Sure. So I suspect a few battalions of scouts might get wrecked analyzing Ruby's weaknesses. What is it? Healed by fire, ice, lightning, earth, immune to gravity and water. So once they figure that out and are able to plan around it, yeah, not a big deal. The hunters have never dealt with anything anywhere near as big as Ruby, but it's still a giant monster with concrete limitations. And like the other weapons, it doesn't seem to be close to as intelligent as the hunters. Just a bit more unpredictable than the other weapons. They'll probably have to scale Ruby to fight it, get to the neck, the eyes, the core, and avoid getting swatted or squashed.
I'm reminded of the flavor text on the Magic the Gathering card Hill Giant. Fortunately, hill giants have large blind spots in which a human can easily hide. Unfortunately, these blind spots are beneath the bottoms of their feet.
Right, one step and squish. And the hunters may have to jump off sometimes, but they have ways to glide, to latch onto other parts of Ruby, or other flying monsters nearby, if there are any. It's not really an issue. Now again, gaming abstraction, but Monster Hunter has no fall damage. Well, the hunters anyway. I make it a point in every Monster Hunter game to climb to the highest point in the world, whether I'm supposed to be there or not, then jump off, and I've never taken fall damage in Monster Hunter. And for Whirl Sand, that's another option. Whirl Sand doesn't target Ruby itself, so if the hunters latch onto Ruby, or are capable of remaining airborne for the entire duration, they'll be fine.
Right. Now if a hunter does get caught in Whirl Sand and they can't get out in time, that's where Palico support comes in, because Palicos are really adept at digging, so they could get the hunter out in time. Ultimately, Ruby is far less of a threat than you'd think. Sure, it's probably going to cart or even kill a bunch of scouts, but the moment they figure out that paralysis is a guaranteed method, Ruby's fate is sealed. So we have one weapon left, and I think that this is going to be the hunter's toughest fight. Emerald Weapon, a name that struck fear into child me. Emerald Weapon is the deepest dwelling weapon. It slowly and silently glides around the sea floor. Like Ruby, it's quite passive. It won't pursue the player's submarine, and there's even a safe zone where you can drive right above Emerald and it can't engage you.
Bet you wish you knew about that when you were a kid.
Oh, definitely. Now, Emerald is pretty passive, until you ram it with your submarine. Then it reacts as you'd expect any creature to react to a giant metal object crashing into it. It gets angry. The moment the battle starts, a 20-minute timer is in place, ticking down to the point where the party succumbs to drowning and the crushing pressure of the seafloor. Kinda generous, right? Most people can't hold their breath that long, let alone on the seafloor, which is where the battle takes place. Now, the party can remove that timer with the underwater materia, which is a whole thing, but it's sort of irrelevant because the hunters won't have access to it. Emerald's size is hard to gauge, but it's probably around the same size as the other weapons, so I'd say 400 meters or so, maybe as big as 500. Not as big as Ruby, but definitely on par with the others. Emerald has the most HP of any monster in the entirety of Final Fantasy VII, at an enormous
1 million.
Emerald has a handful of powerful attacks. Foot Stamp inflicts physical damage on all targets. Emerald Beam does fractional damage equal to 65.625% of the target's current HP to all targets and removes the regen status. Each of Emerald's eyes has an Emerald Laser attack. The blue does magical damage and the yellow damages the target's MP reserves. Emerald Shoot does magic damage and removes the Barrier, Death Force, Resist, M-Barrier, and Shield status effects on one target. Revenge Stamp does physical damage and removes the Haste status on all targets. Finally, and most feared, is Aritam's Storm, which does damage equal to the number of materia a party member has equipped times 1111 and removes Barrier, Death Force, Haste, M-Barrier, Reflect, Regen, Resist, Shield, Slow, and Stop, and it targets the entire party. Now, all of this seems like it would be a nightmare, right? And it is if you're unprepared. But Emerald has a very predictable, learnable pattern, and if you can recognize that pattern and prepare, Emerald is a damage sponge, but not very hard.
And like we've said, that's what the hunters excel in, learning a monster's patterns and developing countermeasures. If Emerald is even more predictable than something like Natalis or a Kirin, then the hunters shouldn't have too much trouble learning its patterns.
Right, that's my conclusion too. Emerald uses a randomly chosen number of emerald shoots, then 1 foot stamp, then emerald shoot, and then emerald beam. It will then activate its eyes, 2 blue and 2 yellow. If you attack the body while the eyes are active, Emerald retaliates with Revenge Stamp. Emerald will keep using Emerald Beam. After 10 Revenge Stamps or 2 Emerald Beams, Emerald will use Aritam Storm. It's a highly telegraphed attack. It takes a while to charge up, so the hunters won't have any trouble getting out of the way. Destroying the eyes will revert Emerald back to its normal behavior. Once Emerald falls below half HP, it will retaliate to the Knights of the Round summon with Aritam Storm even if the eyes aren't active, though that's not really relevant in this fight. Emerald is weak to electricity, healed by ice and water, immune to earth, and takes half damage from gravity, but due to its massive HP pool and gravity being fractional, it doesn't matter. It's immune to all negative status conditions other than blindness and has a very low luck stat, just 1 point, so it's not landing any critical hits. Emerald is sort of quirky out of battle though. It often wanders the seafloor, just peacefully swimming around, but there are some places that it's fond of where it'll just sometimes be found hovering. The maps on screen should give you an idea. The map on the left is the world map with the traversable undersea area highlighted. The map on the right is the undersea field. The yellow bordered area is Emerald's general wandering area, and the red circles are its 3 places where it will sometimes just hover. The one outside of its usual range is the sunken Gelnika, maybe due to the Mako reactor that powered it. The one to the south is the crash location of the Red Leader submarine, which held the huge materia, and maybe that residual Mako is what's attracting Emerald's attention. Finally, the one in the middle is the crater, presumably where Emerald crashed when it was launched out of the northern crater. Some people say it's where the corpse of Sapphire Weapon collapsed, but that makes no sense. Sapphire was point blank in front of Junon when it died, and it clearly wasn't thrown back. This crater is in the middle of the sea floor. So that's Emerald Weapon. The first question for the discussion here is, do the hunters even realize Emerald is down there in the depths of the sea? They don't normally go down that deep, so there are only 2 things I can think of that would alert them to Emerald's existence. First, someone sees Emerald when it crashes into the ocean and reports it to the guild. Second, if tons of deep-sea dwelling monsters start washing up on the beach just utterly destroyed. The hunters are going to know something's down there.
Right. There's 2 scenarios, really. Scenario 1, they have no idea. Emerald is just chilling down there. He's not f***ing with anything, nothing's f***ing with him. Scenario 2, something changes in the environment. Apex monsters wash up on shore, tsunamis, seaquakes. It's not unlike the hunters to slap together an expeditionary mission to see what's going on.
But do the hunters ever go down that far, to the sea floor itself? I know that you said in Monster Hunter 3 there are underwater fights, but Emerald is deep.
We don't know. The underwater ruin is pretty deep, but it's not miles down. It's not the Mariana Trench, but it's deep.
So we have to assume that the hunters can get down there, otherwise the fight just doesn't happen, and that's not what you're here for. You want us to talk about carnage, not the 2 fighting forces never meeting one another on the field of honor.
So, Scenario 1, Emerald is too deep, and the hunters never notice it. Scenario 2, Emerald is noticed, but is too deep for the hunters to engage. Scenario 3, Emerald operates at a depth where the hunters can engage it. Scenarios 1 and 2 are done. The hunters are incapable of interacting with Emerald, and they just go on with their lives.
So assuming they can, they notice Emerald is messing with the ecosystem. I mean, there are big monsters down there, but nothing on Emerald's scale, no super kaiju.
Right, there's one monster that's allegedly the size of an island, and the whole plot around it is to prevent it from waking up. You kill the thing that's bugging it, done, problem solved. Great, now let's go back to pretending this thing doesn't exist, thus solving the problem once and for all. But it's a plot point, nothing you ever get to fight.
So if the hunters can't interact one way or another, it means one of 2 things. Emerald just happily swims around until the end of time, or it gets the command to end the world and the hunters can't do a damn thing about it.
And it's possible that the Doomsday Effect relies on all 5 weapons being present and alive. So in that scenario, Emerald just chills until the end of time. That's sort of all these non-interaction scenarios. But the problem with these scenarios is that they're f***ing boring. So let's make them fight.
Exactly. We talked about that just so you have that answer. I don't want to see, but you didn't talk about what would happen if the hunters never found Emerald. Don't even type that. But fan-fueled fiction, you have to talk about every possible scenario in the history of ever and make a 30-hour-long video on how every hunter ever seen in any Monster Hunter game would react to the weapons. No. Stop it. Bad commenter. Bad. Don't make me get the spray bottle. Don't be that guy. I can see Emerald investigating an underwater temple ruin, just, oh, what's this? Let me go look. And an abyssal Lagiacrus feels threatened and swims out and gets comprehensively wrecked.
And its body washes up on shore a few days later. The hunters find it and decide to investigate. Nothing should be messing up an abyssal Lagiacrus that badly. Let's see what's down there. Generally, in underwater fights in Monster Hunter, there's a breath meter and a bubble mechanic. You have a limited amount of air in your lungs, but you can take another breath by swimming over streams of bubbles coming out from the ground. So the way the hunters will likely fight Emerald is they design some kind of deep water depth charge and try to blast it and lure it to a location they can control.
Just piss off the giant green super kaiju. Great idea.
Exactly. And they may need a few of those to really enrage it enough to lure it to their chosen location. But that's sort of what hunters do. They MacGyver stuff together. If they can't lure Emerald Weapon all the way to where they want the fight to happen, they'd probably make a bubble generator out of a wind sack and a clam.
And I do think they'd be able to lure Emerald. Maybe the first giant barrel bomb would go off and Emerald would be like, hey, that's not nice, but maybe it was an accident. And then they do it again and, hey, now I think you're doing it on purpose. But eventually, they anger Emerald enough for it to chase them and they lure it to their chosen battlefield.
And the hunters' first plan would be to try to lure it to the shallows, where it's easier to confront. But, like you said, when we discussed this, Emerald may just have some programming from the planet that tells it to turn around when it gets into shallow water. So the hunters will have to fight it in the depths. In either case, they'll need time to set up bubble generators, siege weapons, traps, bombs, and so on. And they'd have to develop specialized dragonators and ballistae, and barrel bombs sealed with wax so the gunpowder doesn't get wet. But they can do it.
That's difficult though, because it's infinitely harder to set things up like this underwater. You have to either design it so it won't be affected by the water and the salt, or you have to make it above the surface, waterproof the mechanisms, then sink it down, which poses its own problems.
Right? It's a lot of work, trial and error, resources, and then, sometimes, maybe you go to fire the Dragonator and poof, it just doesn't work. Some seawater got in it and corroded the firing mechanism. So now it's just a lump of expensive metal. And even assuming everything works, it's still a really tough fight. Humans aren't made to live and fight underwater. We adapt, but we're not purpose-built for it like Emerald Weapon is. So you have those limitations too. The hunters will tire faster. They need to keep in mind the need for air. It'll be harder to dodge. All of these will be factors that impact them.
And while the hunters won't have the Remobra to pull them out of danger with grappling, the Hunters Guild could easily put buoys out with long ropes hanging onto heavy weights that can be used as grapple points to pull the hunters out of danger.
Right, and this is doable. I think a few waves of hunters get obliterated by Emerald before they figure out a real working strategy, but they can do it. Like with Ruby, it'll take a lot of hunters getting their shit comprehensively wrecked, and probably quite a few actual deaths, but they'll figure Emerald out. Especially if, as we assume, Eritam Storm does nothing.
Yeah, Eritam Storm likely won't do anything because it specifically targets materia. Now, we had a huge 20-minute tangent when we discussed this, but it boils down to maybe the Hunter's gear would register as materia in the eyes of the planet, except the Hunter's gear isn't made of monsters from this world, so it's alien, and thus the planet wouldn't recognize it no matter how magical it is. So for our argument, we're going to say that Eritam Storm does, nothing. Emerald does its big fancy fanfare wind-up, fires this giant curtain of light, everything goes boom, and it does f*** all.
Did you guys feel anything? The giant green super kaiju just blasted us with light, but I felt nothing. Now, Eritam Storm does remove a bunch of status conditions on the target, so it's possible that some of the effects of items might just end when hit. The immunizer behaves a bit like the regen status in Final Fantasy VII, and that's cancelled by the Eritam Storm, so the immunizer may be as well.
And that raises another interesting question. How do the hunters communicate underwater? I asked this, and you said they'll have trained military-style hand motions, holding up a fist for halt, that sort of thing when they have to be as quiet as possible, but the hunters will have their own commands.
Right, and they might even have flares in different colors that can be lit underwater to signal things like, maybe green is that the Dragonator is ready to fire again. Red is hunter down, need help. Yellow is dangerous attack coming, that sort of thing. In the games, you do have hand signs that you can do that are generally accompanied by a chat message. Everybody stop, that sort of thing. But the chat message is a gaming abstraction. And you'd probably also have these teams of support staff, maybe Palamutes, trained for swimming, carrying extra supplies around.
And it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that they can use the elemental effects too. The scouts could probably figure out, okay, thunder seems to hurt this thing more than anything else, and they have everyone equipped with Keating or Zinogre weapons.
Or whatever the thunder element monster of choice is in the region. And we see in the Monster Hunter games that the electricity is in the weapon itself, so all the physics buffs can stop typing that it would be weaker underwater. And there isn't really a particle effect. The electricity is delivered through the weapon making contact. It's not wasting power on the water itself. The fact that underwater hunts exist means that at least in a game abstraction sense, every hunter's weapon should work underwater.
At least until we get into the non-game media like the animated series. And I see some of you typing in the comments, don't do it. Don't you dare bring up that Paul W.S. Anderson piece of shit affront to the entire Monster Hunter franchise and fanbase in this house.
Now, the hunters may bankrupt an entire region trying to prepare to take this thing out, but, as you so eloquently put it, bankrupting a region is better than the destruction of the world, so it'll happen. The hunters can win. It'll just take a lot of time, energy, resources, and casualties. They've seen attacks like what Emerald does before, so they know how to dodge, how to counter, how to block. Now, a lot of Emerald's attacks animations may be gaming abstraction, like the Ivy. They could be light, or they could be a magical beam of energy that ignores water and just hits hard.
I probably should have said this in the very beginning of the video, but whatever you do, do not play a drinking game where you take a shot every time we say gaming abstraction. You will die of alcohol poisoning a third of the way through the video.
Right, and it's necessary because we're talking about comparing two inherently different gaming franchises. We have to make things abstract so we can look at them more in a vacuum. It's possible that the eye lasers are meant to be beams of light, in which case the hunters aren't dodging it, but they move too slow on screen for them to be lasers. And that's what we have to deal with, what we see, right? If we don't work with what we see, and we just assume, then it makes just as much sense to say that these are beams of concentrated sunshine and blue raspberry Kool-Aid. And we think Aritam's storm would be pretty useless. Sure, it's a bright flash of light underwater, so it could briefly blind the hunters. It may be able to remove the effects of buffs and items, but it's not doing damage. It's an annoying flashbang, that's it. So it may actually be even more advantageous for the hunters to just take out both the blue eyes, which do actual damage, and leave the two yellow eyes active, which drain MP, and avoid dealing with some of Emerald's attacks that it doesn't use when the eyes are active.
And if they can find a way to infuse the thunder element into their siege weapons, it'll go even faster. A machine cannon that fires electric rounds at a high rate of fire is going to take a pretty solid chunk out of Emerald's massive HP bar. Lightning cannons, lightning dragonators, lightning barrel bombs, anything they can infuse the element into is going to help a bit. If they can get this all ready before they lure Emerald over, they can set up a kill box. Detonate 500 lightning element barrel bombs in its face, spear it with 30 lightning dragonators that have spikes made of keating bones, hit it with a hail of lightning gunfire and ballistae bolts and cannonballs and whatever else.
And maybe we're underestimating the damage numbers, and they take it out in like an hour. It's a gaming abstraction. Damage numbers and HP pools measured by numbers, we can't pin down exactly how damage translates between the two games.
I will pin the comment of the first person that accurately counts how many times we say game abstraction or gaming abstraction in this video. But as long as the hunters have the resources and the intel, there's very little they can't overcome, and given Emerald's lack of visible intelligence, I can't see why they wouldn't be able to.
Long ago in a distant land.
The legends are incomplete in Monster Hunter, but they say that long ago humanity threw the world out of balance with industrialization and conquest. Nature retaliated by creating monsters. The legend has mostly been lost, so we don't know if elder dragons always existed and were dormant like the weapons, or if they were created for the purpose of balancing the scales. It is implied, or at least theorized, that this first monster was Fatalis. When we talk, you always ask about the scale of power, and it's a different kind of mentality here. It's not the scale of power necessarily that enacts the apocalypse. It's the consequences of devastation. Ruby Weapon could enact an apocalypse by throwing every grain of sand in the desert up into the atmosphere and blocking out the sun, right? Ice Age. Ruby doesn't need to be particularly powerful to do that. It doesn't need to blow up the planet like Majin Buu or Broly to end all life on the planet. It just has to have the ability to control sand well enough to block out the sun. Ruby could be 2 inches tall and have the physical strength of a gnat and still be able to end the world.
Like Kirby!
Yes, like Kirby. Kirby is canonically a world breaker, and I know you threw that in for one of your friends. But it's the same way in Monster Hunter. What qualifies something as an Elder Dragon isn't size or physical strength. It's the effect on the environment. Your favorite example of giant monsters, the Laviente, it's not classified as an Elder Dragon. Elder Dragons aren't just big, strong, and mean. They have a fundamental effect on anything that even gets near them. They alter the climate. They disrupt the landscape. Shigaru Magala sheds scales that have a frenzy virus that sends other monsters into a rage-filled frenzy, attacking anything that comes near. It's an Elder Dragon not because it's blowing up a forest, but because it flies over the forest and the forest ecosystem is gone in a day, as every living thing in the forest tears each other apart in a maddened bloodlust. Elder Dragons are classified as such because if they walk through a place, that place is probably f***ed. The Kushala Daora creates massive whirlwinds, which take on the elemental affinity of whatever's around it. In Arctic regions, those winds become icy tornadoes. In deserts, they become sandstorms. They're not super aggressive though. They can just wreck everything around them if they get too agitated. They're only a problem in the range of its wind-creating effects. So when Kushala is spotted headed towards a village, it's usually the goal not to bother killing it, but to annoy it enough to make it change directions.
But can Elder Dragons be killed? They sound like they're sort of facts of reality. If Fatalis is the monster, the original Elder Dragon, and you kill it in one game, then does it come back? Is that not canon that it's dead? Or is it sort of a Captain Jack scenario where it just regenerates and sits back up, annoyed but no worse for wear? Or are there multiple of each Elder Dragon?
We don't know. It's sort of ambiguous. So, from a gaming abstraction, it's absolutely possible. You kill Fatalis, you harvest its parts, and you go out the next day to do it again and get more Fatalis parts.
Like SCP-682, where you can cut its head off, strip the skull of flesh, and after a few days, the headless body will track down its head and the skull will start laughing and biting people's arms off until it's reattached. The wiki seems to indicate that it's not an individual, but a whole species. A few places online seem to indicate that the only unique monster, the one that only one individual exists of, is Shara Ishvalda and maybe the Valhazak. It's just that the others are crazy rare. Conversations I've seen online on forums and the like seem to support this idea that most Elder Dragons are rare, but not unique.
Sure, and there's no cutscene of Fatalis getting back up. There's no established info lore-wise of how there's always a Fatalis. But that's still possibly a gaming abstraction. It would be a bad game if it told me you need to get 37 horns from this thing, but I can only fight it 3 times, and it only drops 1 horn each time. So, it's a question of established gaming abstraction versus unconfirmed lore.
If we had a nickel for every time we said gaming abstraction in this video, I wouldn't need a sponsor. But the same is true of the weapons. We don't know what the process is. Now, I am playing through Crisis Core, and apparently there is a weapon that looks like Emerald as an Easter egg, but it's confirmed by the developers not to be Emerald. It does have the ridges and eyes like Emerald, so my theory is it's sort of a larval Emerald, but we don't know. It's sort of implied that the last time the weapons were awakened was when Genova crashed into the planet, so that's hundreds, maybe thousands of years ago. Either the planet takes a long-ass time to make them, or they were made fairly quickly and just dormant for eons. The planet may have just made the 5 and thought, you know what, this is enough, I don't need more than this. If you'll allow me to blaspheme a bit, the planet created the 5 weapons, and in her infinite wisdom, she thought it good.
But yeah, we don't know. We don't have a proper scale for how powerful the Elder Dragons are, nor do we have a real scale for the scope of destruction for the weapons.
Right, the big theme in both settings is that humanity versus nature aspect. In Final Fantasy VII, it's the planet sensing the imbalance, the danger of Sephiroth, the abuse of the lifestream by Shinra, and so it wakes up the weapons, and they're the hammer waiting to be dropped. Shinra develops mech suits like the Proud Clod as anti-weapon artillery, and Sephiroth doesn't really care. He's in his hole doing his whole I will become a god and rule over every soul thing.
And you've gone after the weapons countless times, not because you have to, or because it's tied to the story, but because it's there. You test yourself against it, knowing that it can really mess you up, but every time it messes you up a little less, until you win.
Right, that's the whole mentality behind roguelikes too. Hades, for example, you get to the Furies kill you, so you start over and over and over until you beat the Furies. Then the Lernian Bone Hydra kills you, so you get better and better until you can kill Lernie. And then you fight your way through Elysium until you fight Theseus. Go eat it, Theseus. And that's the draw of it, to test your mettle against insurmountable odds. It's the same way with the weapons.
and the destruction of the weapons may have far-reaching consequences. We don't see that. You mentioned that 500 years after the game's end, Red 13 has children and they visit the ruins of Midgar, overgrown with plant life, but it's the same with the monsters. Could they destroy the world? Maybe. So, to answer the question, no, I don't think there's a direct equivalent to the weapons in Monster Hunter. Fatalis is probably the closest you'll get, and that's only if you work on the assumption that Fatalis was that original monster.
Right, and that's sort of my point. If the hunters can overcome Fatalis, not nearly as big, but far more cunning and aggressive, they can overcome the weapons with enough planning and understanding.
At least temporarily, right? Maybe the planet would be like, okay, give me a few thousand years. I'll make them even bigger and better, and they'll get you next time.
Mission failed. We'll get them next time.
There is no monster that the hunters think is unassailable, that they just say, nope, not getting involved. There are monsters too big and dangerous for some hunters, but there is someone at the guild that can fight the big monsters. We see that in Final Fantasy VII too. Shinra repeatedly throws stuff at the weapons and nothing works, so finally the last surviving member of Shinra's executive board turns to Cloud and says, please help us. And Cloud does what Cloud does best. He goes in and he fucks shit up.
So yeah, the hunters could beat the weapons. We're giving the weapons a lot of benefit of the doubt, giving them the maximum size, extrapolating their abilities as much as is reasonable, and we still think the hunters probably win. It'll take time, resources, cost a not insignificant number of lives, but they can do it.
And it's also worth discussing whether it's worth it. Will the hunters deem taking out the weapons worth all the money, the time, the death? And that depends on whether the weapons actually represent the end of the world, the extinction of humanity. They certainly aren't that aggressive most of the time.
Except for Sapphire, it's the smallest, maybe it's the weakest. So maybe that's why it's so aggressive. It's insecure. The others are like, I don't need to prove anything to you.
Right, Sapphire's mentality is, I'm a big fishy, I can prove it. Watch me fire a laser beam from my mouth at this big building, oh, my head is gone.
Yeah. So the hunters won't be picking a fight unless they conclude that the weapons pose an imminent threat to the safety of the world. Unless there are legends, like there are in Final Fantasy VII, that say these things are world enders.
That's the only situation in which it makes sense that the hunters would actively hunt down the weapons not to contain or study them, but to exterminate them. If the hunters see them pose a threat to the ecosystem, they might want to study them, but the only we have to kill these things mindset arises if there are legends of them being world enders on a scale beyond Fatalis. Now, let's talk about some alternate scenarios, just briefly.
So we first have to talk about the hunters being taken to the Final Fantasy VII world. The big question there is whether it's all hunters with their resources, a single expedition team. Is it a single hunter? These all change things. If we're looking at a single hunter, maybe the player character, their best option would be to track down Cloud and his friends and be like, hey, I'm a skilled warrior from another world. I deal with giant monsters every day. Can I join up? And then there's a question of resources. The hunter wouldn't have access to monster bits anymore, so they'd have to make do with the modern tech of the Final Fantasy world. They might not even be able to use materia, because that's what's established in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, that those not born on the planet are unable to call upon her power.
Naturally formed materia. And look at the size of it. Astounding. For the Mako energy to condense into something like this, it must have taken an eternity.
I've always wondered, how does materia let you cast spells exactly?
How did you ever get to be a soldier? To put it simply, the knowledge of the ancients is sealed within each orb. That knowledge not only connects us to the planet, it allows us to tap into her power. That's how we can use magic. Or so they say.
Really?
It's a little unclear. Hojo objects to the use of the word magic to refer to what materia can do, but he can offer no better term. In episode Yuffie of On the Way to a Smile, it's explained that materia is triggered by a shock from the user's mind, which means that repeated use without rest can tax the mind and body. It seems like it requires skill and training. All the party members have at least some experience in training with it, so we don't see them struggling to learn. So it's possible that since the knowledge is contained within, that with training and understanding of how it works, someone like a hunter that has a pseudo-magical connection could learn to use it, but I doubt they'd be able to use it as effectively as someone born in the world. They're not going to be able to have an MP capacity of 999 like Cloud and Company, but they'll be able to use it at a diminished level.
The hunters are tactical too. They could give advice on how to approach something of the scale of the weapons. It's not really changing the outcome, just the rules of engagement. The hunter can't grab a greatsword from the quartermaster, so they just borrow one of Cloud's swords and get into the fight, or one of Vincent's rifles and use it like a bowgun, or Sid's spear.
I see you have a giant sword on your back. Do you have a spare? I use something similar in my world. And Cloud just hands over a blade. Here, this is my Ragnarok. Use this. And they stand side by side, kill the weapons, wreck Sephiroth, and go out for a drink at Tifa's new bar that I'm sure she'll build after Final Fantasy VII is over.
Yeah, and it's possible that in the opposite scenario, with the weapons mysteriously dropped into the Monster Hunter world, they just go dormant. With no connection to the life stream, they don't have a drive anymore, and just become part of the landscape, a curiosity. Or, and this will tie into our next section, they could go berserk immediately and start destroying everything.
They can't feel the life stream, so they think the planet isn't just in danger, but beyond saving.
You're missing the point. There's no throne. There is no version of this where you come out on top. Maybe your army comes, and maybe it's too much for us, but it's all on you. Because if we can't protect the Earth, you can be damn well sure we'll avenge it.
Or maybe the weapons just wander. They're so alien that even the Elder Dragons don't recognize them as man-made or natural, so they just leave them alone. Ruby finds a desert and just chills for the next few million years, and parents tell their children about the strange red tower that just waves in the desert.
Right? We don't know. Whatever we say on this sort of subject beyond our speculations so far is less than fan fiction. Which brings us to our next section. Would the hunters be able to handle Rampage and weapons?
So we'll be dealing with two things. First, we'll see the monster riders come out to help. It's an emergency situation. All hands on deck. To use your favorite term for it from the SCP Foundation, it's a XK class end of the world scenario. And they have to go all in against something that could actually wipe out all life. It's not a matter of revealing the presence of the riders anymore. It's a matter of not being wiped out. Then there's a matter of operating on a much shorter time scale. The weapons are all active, and they're trying to wipe out all life. In our previous discussions, the hunters could send waves of scouts, then hunters, and they could send 30 well-trained maxed rank hunters at once. With all 5 weapons, they have far less time to study, and their resources are going to be split 5 ways.
And the sad fact is that when Emerald Weapon shows up, for example, in this sort of time crunch, you can't get the whole world moving to a location instantly. So the top 10 hunters in the area just may not be underwater combat specialists and they get killed unceremoniously.
The thinkers in the guild will probably try to approximate a time frame, and then base training and scouting off of that before sending the hunters in.
And that will necessarily result in some sacrificial lamb types. Some lower ranking hunters going in knowing, I am not going to survive this, but if my death is the price I pay to ensure the stronger hunters have a chance to stop this thing from killing the people I love, I pay it gladly. This is what I can do. I cannot defeat this monster. I cannot win, but I can buy time.
Right. And it ends up with the hunters not having as much time to plan or stress test equipment. That airship we mentioned might fall apart mid-fight because they didn't get to fully test the thing, and that could potentially lose the battle with Ultimate Weapon.
And here's the interesting one. What if the Monster Hunter world itself decides that the rampaging weapons are a threat? It sends in the monsters. Imagine Elder Dragons and Hunters fighting side by side. Fatalis and entire skulks of Mizutsune, schools of Gen Moran, and countless other species all fighting alongside the humans to destroy the weapons. That would be like 14-year-old me's ideal movie.
Just dozens of Abyssal Lagiacrises showing up to fight Emerald, or a school of Darin Moran swarming Ruby, right? It also depends on if the planet itself is intelligently targeting the monsters or just sending whatever's nearby, and if it's overriding their base instincts. A Devil Joe in this scenario should rush the hunters. It goes after the weakest enemy first, but under direct supervision of the planet, it could go attack Diamond Weapon. The planet just telling it, we need that one dead. Go deal with that one.
Maybe after you wreck the giant diamond monster, I'll let you rampage for a bit, but for now, go take that thing out. Now, this isn't anywhere close to canon. This is wild, unfounded fanfiction, but we wanted to include it because, come on, it's cool. And it might change things, again, depending on time frame. Let's give them a week, which is sort of my headcanon of around how long the weapons would take before really going active, based on Cloud saying that they have about a week from when they're about to go fight Sephiroth.
Yeah, I'd think that's enough time. Assuming they know they have that week, right? Assuming the planet knows, and it's not just slapdash get them in there as they come, but a mustering of forces.
Every single person is going to have to pick up a weapon. The hunters, great and small, the scouts, the school teachers, the farmers, the kids, because in the face of species-wide extinction, you can't afford not to fight.
Now, the non-combatant people are probably going to just do running tasks, bringing gear to the hunters, but yeah, they may have to fight eventually. They don't have the super strength or the training that the hunters do. But like you said, total extinction is too terrifying not to fight if you have to.
And if the monsters are just sort of gathering and waiting, the hunters might think, okay, maybe we have more time than we thought. If a monster is acting weird, the immediate conclusion from the hunters is, well, something must be up. So if 500 of the most aggressive monster species that usually shred each other the moment they lay eyes on each other are standing next to one another staring into a crater, something's up. And I know you said that many of the Elder Dragons can't turn off their destructive abilities, but the wiki seems to indicate that the Kushala can turn its wind off when it wants, and that Fatalis can radiate immense heat, not that it always does. So it's possible that the planet could send in these Elder Dragons and just not have them use their world-altering abilities unless necessary to win. Any Monster Hunter experts in the comments, feel free to weigh in on what you've seen out there on your hunts. So now, let's talk about our final thoughts. So, I thought this was going to be a stomp. I thought the weapons would utterly annihilate the hunters without a second thought. I was even debating not doing this video because I thought it would be such a total wipe. But with the usual genius and eloquence, Aki explained that I was wrong and made infinity good points. So yeah, now I'm pretty convinced that in most standard situations, the hunters take it. They suffer casualties, definitely, but they win in the end. It's not a question of if the hunters can win, they will, just how much time and effort it takes.
'Twas never a matter of if, only when.
Right? And it's possible that it might even be easier for the hunters. We're giving the weapons every possible consideration. By highballing the weapons, we established whether there is any chance at all, and the hunters can still find victory. We're doing it that way so that we can confidently say, yes, we think these things are bigger than any monster the hunters have ever had to deal with before. They're massive, they're powerful, they're stronger. But even if that's the case, they still are just monsters. And this is an average Tuesday for the hunters, overcoming impossible odds.
At the end of the day, this is what the hunters do. It's not a hobby, it's not an obsession, it's not an indulgence. This is their job, their role in life, protecting their entire species from monsters that can do insane things. It's rare for a person to find their true purpose in life, but that's what the hunters are, that's what they're born to do, and they do it well. They're not just warriors, they're heroes. They fight, they struggle, and sometimes they die so that others don't have to.
And in the end, that's the hunter's greatest strength. They can be faced with monsters as big as mountains that can breathe fire and lightning and death, and they will band together, stand as brothers and sisters in arms against a threat too fierce for others to face. Because they know they're not facing it alone. They have each other. They have the scouts. They have their palicos. They have the guild backing them.
They have the hopes and dreams of all those they fight for at their backs. And those diverse strengths and weaknesses create a lot of opportunities. Sure, they could throw hundreds of scouts at the weapons and not make a dent. The scouts aren't really fighters, they're meant to probe weaknesses. But once the scouts relay their information, the hunters can win. It's a team effort. The hunters have everything they need in most circumstances. Prep time, intelligence, cunning, tools, experience.
Whereas the weapons seem to just be power. There's no real intelligence, no planning, just destruction.
It's right in the name, weapon. They're the hammer that the planet drops, they're the sword that the planet swings. They have basically no more influence over the swinging of the sword than a sword does in the hands of a swordsman.
A weapon is a tool. It's used. It doesn't think, and any weapon can be broken.
Right? My understanding from Monster Hunter World was just that the Scout Corps exists, not that it's this tactical or dedicated. My understanding was basically, oh, so I saw some monsters in that area. That one had wings, that one was big, and I think that one was orange. Go hit it with a sword. No, it's much more nuanced and advanced. My problem with Monster Hunter was how slow and deliberate it is. My combat preference is more Bayonetta or Metal Gear Rising, rushing in and going full rules of nature on a giant enemy and flipping them into the air. I still don't think Monster Hunter is going to be my favorite franchise, but I can see now that it's not a deliberate slowness as a detriment. It's to the franchise's benefit. It's not what I like in combat, but I can definitely see the draw.
And that's what I love about it. I'm sure that if you're watching this video and hearing these words, you love it too.
Or you just really love the sound of my voice, in which case,
Get help. No.
Yeah, and what I love is, given enough time, study, and preparation, you can win against a monster 30, 40, 100 times your size.
And just to mention it, I don't know if Cloud and his friends could have stopped the weapons if they rampaged.
But under most circumstances, the hunters have the drive, the numbers, the experience, and the resources to overcome the weapons. If there's a variable you think we missed, leave a comment. And if we think it's a significant enough change, we might make a video about it.
Was there anything that really shocked or surprised you, Aki?
Well, the sheer size and scope of the weapons is always a bit much to get my brain around. They're huge, and they're ancient.
And that's a thing that a lot of people have trouble getting their minds around, because that scale is hard for us. We have, what, 80, 100 years on this Earth, if we're lucky? And that's a blink of an eye to the life of a planet, and the life of a planet is the blink of an eye to the universe. It's humbling, but also kind of hopeful, because it means there will be people after us, and they could be better because of the legacy we leave. We are ephemeral, so the best we can do is leave the world just a little bit better than we found it, a little happier, a little brighter, a little bit more love in the world. And that's my challenge for my viewers today. Do something positive. For yourself maybe, self-improvement, or some act of kindness for no other reason than it can help someone else. One of my favorite quotes ever from Aesop: "No act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted."
Don't ask for a miracle, be the miracle.
Hunters beating Fatalis isn't a miracle. A hunter stopping to give their hard-earned Fatalis scale to a child as a keepsake on the way home is a miracle. It's a miracle because of how it can change a life. It's those little things that inspire those around us that can change the world. So, Monster Hunter Wilds is out now when you watch this video. Go get it. I plan to get it at some point. I know Aki will get it. Maybe we'll see you in game sometime. Maybe we'll hunt together. I just want to thank Aki for joining me on this adventure of a video. It certainly was a trip making it. Your insight has been invaluable, and thank you for spending about 13 hours on the phone with me recording the preliminary transcript for this.
It was a blast. Thank you for having me, and for everyone who got through to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys the next time I come to visit.
I'd also like to thank DJ Micah, who allowed me to use a ton of their music, Team Darkside for letting me using some of their clips to highlight how different weapons function, especially the lance, Just Spencer36 for giving me a few good clips of weapon basics, and of course, all of you for watching. Again, thank you so much for watching. This video was a nightmare to make, but I think it was worth it. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment. While you're down there, please hit the subscribe button and the like button. It helps a lot. I reply to every comment too, so I'm always happy to converse with you. If you want to watch another video with Aki in it, click here for our video discussing Count Dooku vs Mace Windu, or here for my Sephiroth video where Aki talks about the origin of the name. Or, if you want more of a monster fix, click here for my video on the Pharaxa. I really wish more people would watch that one. Thank you again so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.